Okay, folks, I'm sorry we have to have a relaunch, but there's been no other way of avoiding the problems that have arisen. So we'll go back to the talk on French Island, the closest wilderness area to Melbourne. French Island, our nearest wilderness, recollections and my diary, 1966 to 78. Tonight's program of video will be mainly concerned with that mysterious piece of land in the middle of Western Port that very few people visit, French Island. It's only 60 kilometres from the middle of the city, and for all of that, because there's no road connection with the rest of the Australian mainland, you might as well be 400 or 500 kilometres from Melbourne once you get to French Island. It's an extraordinary place. I visited the place first with my mother on a trip on the Phillip Island ferry, which in 1966, the last day of 1966 in fact, was a wooden ferry. I believe may have been either a wooden ferry from the Sydney Harbour Ferry Service, certainly not seaworthy, or something of that nature, that sort of size and service capability. And the Phillip Island ferry used to do a trip from Stony Point, where there was a railhead. You could actually get to Stony Point on public transport, which was a major attraction for those who are eccentric enough not to own or drive a car, like myself or Peter, VK3AML. So you would take the train to Stony Point, then the ferry, which would touch at Tankerton on French Island before heading for Cowes on Phillip Island. And I was interested on that 1966 trip to have a look at French Island simply because so few people knew what was there. In those days there was a working prison on the island, and when we got to the drop-off point at French Island, the Tankerton pier, I said to the guy on the pier, can we get off and have a look round? And he said to me, almost in astonishment and half in suspicion, why do you want to come and have a look here? There's nothing to see, was the quote. Anyway, I thought I'd come and have a look round, and he said, well, you know, we suspect people if they come looking around here, because they may have some connection with the prison farm that's on the far side of the island. So my mother sort of grabbed me by the arm, dragged me away, and said, look, let's not bother with this, let's just go to Cowes and have our regular day out, which we did. But that was my first contact with French Island. I remember steaming south of Tankerton after touching at that pier and having a close look at Tortoise Head, a high promontory at the southwest corner of French Island, which has attracted the attention of artists right back to Eugen von Gerard in the 1860s, who sketched it on a sailboat also heading for Phillip Island. Anyway, I didn't see anything of French Island then for the next 12 years until 1978. And in those days, I was working a bit for the ABC in radio talks and documentaries. And I'd had a really bad week, and there was, I think, some reason that my work was in recess. I think there may have been actually some sort of a strike at the ABC. So I went to French Island to cool off and to assuage my long-term curiosity about the place, and I took with me not a camera but this exercise book, and I made extensive daily notes with the intention of eventually writing an article in one of the local magazines. I originally thought the Learning Exchange might be a suitable magazine for it, and I'd done some work for the Learning Exchange writing about my former domicile on Flinders Island, which had occurred the previous year, 1977. But anyway, I've never made the contents of the diary that I kept on French Island in 1978 public. And one of the naturalists in their local land care group said to me that after I read him a little bit of it some time back, that it's now of historic interest because it's 43 years ago. So, for the next half hour, I hope with illustrations of several of the points that I'm making in this ancient diary, remembering that I was 24 years old when this was written, and it's in a much more flowery style than I would now write. But I'll quote it. So I'll take you back 43 years. Saturday, September the 30th, 1978. I arrived at Flinders Street at 7:45 on an earlier train than that listed. Very few people are about this time of the morning. A dark day with heavy nimbus covering the sky and all faces on platform 9. I hope this overcrowding isn't an omen of things to come. It's been an absolute bum of a week for me, overloaded at work, glad that there's a hold-up, need to get away. A few guys are loping about the railway yards here in railway uniform, tired and limp, probably on the morning after the night before. And the old Frank Bow Repair pool is coming down to make way for God knows what. The Frankston train is exactly the tedium it always was. A suburban crawl to Mordialloc in the Red Rattler, then the beachside crawl to Frankston. Do you know, I've not been on the diesel Rattler from Frankston to Stony Point since the end of 1966. Come to think of it, I was half my present age then. So I can literally say it's been half a lifetime since I last attempted this trip to French Island. Frankston, and the world's aglow with morning sunshine. The old Rattler's raring to go. Looks like the rickety old thing I take so often between Canberra and Goulburn, all timber and creak, with foot warmers and high-backed seats. Vinyl. Very 1950. Could almost be the same bomb I rode to the French Island ferry in 66. The thought of what I might see at Stony Point now that the oil boom has come to stay is a little daunting. Last time I was at Stony Point, I remember a sleepy little railhead with a beach nearby of black pebbles, very shallow. The tide would go out for miles, leaving the fishing boats moored close offshore, high on their keels. Don't remember any oil refineries or large moorings then. A week ago at the Tourist Bureau in Collins Street, they called this Stony Point line the slow train. I see the reason now, but don't mind at all. I don't think any of the other passengers do either. Such a profusion of wildflowers, a bush rhapsody of white, green and gold, though these days the odd subdivision makes an infertile mechanised intrusion into the older and more noble scrub. Some parts of this central section of Mornington Peninsula remind me of the Midlands of Flinders Island, around the White Mark Dam. Baxter Station hasn't changed from 66 except for a pebble-finished toilet block, but the subdivisions and brick venereal are making a march up to its rustic simplicitude, making it seem a bit out of place these days. And at each railway crossing, a teenage girl sits astride a horse, waiting for the train to pass. Some things haven't changed. One girl on a horse raced the train just outside Tyab. Stony Point these days is big, or at least so it seems from the train. Rare sights and sounds. On the ferry, how the thick smell of dieseline brings memories of my days on the fishing boats on Flinders Island. Boats not changed a bit. Same old tub from 1966, seems a little smaller, but then again I'm much larger. The bay is tranquil and placid, Western Port Bay, rippled to the caress of a gentle breeze. And the island, French island, seems to have more beaches than memory would have me believe. But as I was to find, most of these beaches are a deceptive overlay of silt on thick, black, smelly mud. Tankerton Pier, 15 minutes later, and we're in another world. Off the boat, along the pier to an atmosphere not unlike Flinders Island. Rusty cars all in a row at the jetty. Some decrepit but character-filled sheds are around, and the sign, General Store 1.5 miles, pointing east. Well, that direction was as good as any other to take. Dirt roads, rough and unsurfaced in front of me. People with faces to match. So many swans in the broad, weed-filled tidal flats of Tankerton, and the incredible silence of this world almost devoid of cars. Such simplicitude. In most directions lies low scrub and broad green pasture, no real settlement, just occasional clusters of buildings along the road. No telegraph poles, no electric lights, no power cables, and rolling, lonely hills. Away up the road, a hall came in sight, a shire hall, a large cement brick building with a couple of derelict outhouses. As I later found out, they were generator sheds for lighting. A roughly glassed oval with a very uneven goalposts, rough-hewn from the straighter branches of a cut-down eucalypt, can be found here, and a sign is chalked on the door, quote, "No beer," unquote. I knocked twice on the door. The knock echoed inside. Not a sound, not a reply. Crossing to the outhouses and peeping inside, I was startled by a black jackrabbit glaring at me from a hole in one corner of the building. He scurried off. Surveying the building's contents, I found an old shower room which was being used as a junk shed, and something that once would have passed for changing rooms. This has a past. Back to the main road. The wildflowers were out, lining the culverts and lowing to the breeze, pink and yellow and white. Up ahead, on a hill, a cluster of buildings. As they came closer, it didn't seem like a general store, but the pillar box and incongruously isolated phone box were the telltale signs of a post office, Tankerton Post Office. In I went to my first contact with French Island people. A tallish man with glasses was chatting to the store lady. I didn't hear what they were saying, as I was too busy trying to think of what I should buy. A can of Fanta was sitting on the counter. The store lady broke away from her conversation, a typical country lady with a rather warm smile, aged in her 40s somewhere. "Can I help you?" "I'd like a can of Fanta, please." "No, make that 2, please." She smiled at me and withdrew to another room to retrieve them from a refrigerator. Another woman, with a toddler in tow, probably the first's daughter, said with a charming smile, "Are you right?" She was trying to lend a hand. "Thanks," I said, "I'm being served." "Oh," she said, "aren't you just the toff?" The guy turned to her. "Are you being served, sir?" We all laughed. Of course, this was the day of that British comedy show. Leaving them to their fun, I investigated the phone box outside. Very rarely used and full of cobwebs. And the damn thing wouldn't dial STD, one of those old button A and button B things. Operator said a call had to be booked. Then the bastard of a device wouldn't return my 20-cent coin, the only coin I had. Jammed in the box through lack of use, I guess. The guy from the shop with the glasses, the tall guy, passed me, turned and said, "Can I offer you a lift?" I guess the backpack might have been a giveaway. "I'm going to the McLeod prison farm," he said, so I had visions of going there and never coming back. But I took up the offer and asked him if he knew anything about the old prison farm. "Sure do," he said. "I'm in charge of it." For the next 14 miles along the island's rough dirt roads, I quaffed on my 2 cans of Fanta while he described the place to me. It had become a national fitness camp run by the government. I was shown a stand of eucalypts with their crowns all missing along the road. "Koala damage," he said. "And they were introduced here," he said. "They've reached almost plague proportions too." He pointed out the way that ants had built their mounds up around the entrances to their burrows, their nests. "A sure sign of rain," he said, "sort of an ant barometer." We chatted about the differences between Flinders Island and this one. He mentioned that he'd like to introduce the Cape Barren geese here more than they're currently found. Meanwhile, I seemed to impress him by knowing all the names of the coastal birds as we passed them, like the swamp harriers, which hovered either side of the track, waiting to swoop on some poor swamp rat. The memory of what I'd learned on Flinders Island was paying off. After getting some impression of the island's enormity, it was almost twice the area of Phillip Island, I told him of my research at the State Library, my preparatory research into the early prisoners magazine published at McLeod. He seemed impressed that I knew so much about the place before coming here. A few more rolling hills, then the farm hove in sight, hardly visible for the tall pines surrounding it. A few teenagers were wandering about there, smiling at each other and obviously having fun. A cluster of strong concrete buildings set in the midst of the camp at the foot of the cleft formed by a small stream called Brella Creek. Everybody seemed friendly. The camp officer, Keith Sullivan was his name, invited me to use the camp as a base for operations, and on arrival at McLeod handed me a recent detailed scouting map of the island, suggesting that if I were interested in bird and animal life, there are potoroos also here, but no wombats, that I should head for the Duck Splash, as it was called, on the north side of the island, or maybe Spit Point at the eastern end of French Island. The walk to Spit Point and back totalled 10 miles. It was exceedingly taxing through the roughness of the track, the incredible size, persistence and number of mosquitoes, which meant that you couldn't stop for fear of attracting a huge retinue of the beasts, and of course snakes. The way up the hill was attended by broad tracts of pine plantation and scrub, which extended to the edges of the old prison farm. Some land beyond the boundaries of the farm is now covered with large areas of waist-high scrub, reclaiming the land from the earlier days of chicory farming. Most of the ridges and nearly all of the land around Scrub Point is much as it must have been before White Man, and very seldom visited. The bush is very thick, nearly impenetrable, and attended by isolated marshy patches overlying thick black mud, which of course is impassable. Some interesting things about this track. It rounds a broad ridge, then descends to broad tidal mud flats at a place called Gartsides at the north side of the island. There's a small tin hut just above this beach on a grassy bank. From there, where the road branches off along the north coast to the east, to the marshes just inland of Scrub Point, is totally untouched country. Lots of wildflowers and open forest with very thick undergrowth. In places, the road is covered in water and not trafficable to other than four-wheel drive vehicles. I was impressed by the area's quiet and isolation, except for the occasional sounds of aircraft and powerboat motors on Western Port, and there was an amazing variety of wildlife. At one point, in the middle of the road just past the hut by the beach, was a largish patch of sundew plants, insect-eating plants surprisingly devoid of captured insects. Somehow the plethora of mosquitoes managed to escape their sticky trap. At length the track disappears into large tracts of marsh. While I tried many of the forks at the end of this track, I found no way through to the sand dunes which are supposed to surround Scrub Point. These marshes are deceptive, covered in some sort of succulent reddish-yellow weed. Implies a solid surface that actually isn't there. On the marshes are large numbers of swans, rather like those on Logan's Lagoon on Flinders Island. The trip back was exhausting and certainly wasn't helped by my nearly standing on a large snake which was basking in the afternoon sun in a mud patch at the middle of the track. Despite the initial shock, I wasn't attacked, and the beggar, about a 1.5 inch diameter and about 5 feet long, took to his heels and went bush. The trouble with hiking at the north side of French Island is the enormous mosquito population. Nowhere have I seen them more prevalent. There are still large numbers on the south side near the prison farm, but those to the north have to be experienced to be believed. Clouds of them. They're probably attracted to the slow-moving still pools in the tidal mudflats, the mangrove swamps, the place where the stunted mangrove proliferates. Returning to camp, I pitched my tent by the stables and drifted off to a sleep of exhaustion after collecting some water from the kitchen. The island's stream water is unsafe to drink, containing some sort of poison that Keith Sullivan of the National Fitness Camp warned me against. So I relied on camp rainwater. Even that is partly derived from a bore high above the beach, and it contains traces of Epsom salts. But given that I'm eating lots of dehydrated food, that's all to the good. One gets used to the taste of these bore water springs after the first couple of pints, and then you find the taste hard to detect even if you try to imagine it after the first 24 hours or so. Evening came on still and romantic after my snooze in the tent, and a short walk to the very substantial Freeman's Point jetty revealed the sun sinking lazily into the golden west, backed by broad vistas of scrub and farmland on the island, and across the water in contrast Coronella with a swarm of holiday shacks. Few people realise the way to get here, I'm sure. McLeod has its own generating plant with streetlights in the immediate vicinity, making short sorties safe at night. I hit the sack just before the end of twilight to the tune of folk dances going on in the mess hall. Wouldn't you know it, just as I went off to sleep, the strains of Jack O'Hagan's Road to Gundagai and Crow-a-Jingalong in dance rhythm came through. Somehow I don't think I'll ever escape sound archiving totally. Sunday, October 1st, 1978. I stayed in the tent till 9 a.m. trying to catch up on my notes. The rest of this I'm writing on the end of the Freeman's Point jetty, a bright sunny day with wisps of cirrus in a bright blue sky. This is an extraordinarily peaceful spot. I woke up more refreshed than I had in months, thus removed from the troubles of Melbourne and work. The day was clear, revealing the greenness of the surroundings, with swallows flitting about under the pier. I only wish that I didn't have to come out here to escape the mozzies. Morning saw me taking a walk east along the beach past Blue Gum Point. The waters immediately off the shoreline abound with small, spotty parrotfish lying sleepy in the shallow water. Much of the area immediately inshore from the beach is swamp, bearing the nests of many swans. Silver tussock areas are to be found here. The beaches fronting onto the sea cliffs are generally more pleasant to walk through the lack of biting insects from the swamps. All of these areas are alive with wildflowers. Swans, pipits and dotterels are everywhere. I have to watch for eggs on the beach. The swampy areas seem quite unique. They have their water level several feet above the surrounding sea, though they are divided from the sea by only a few feet of sandy embankment. Flora is reminiscent of the Florida Everglades or the far northeast of Tasmania, heathland, wild and ancient, quite untouched. Redweed covers the water, with mosquitoes gliding about on top of it. I'll just interrupt that there to say this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima testing on 147.475 and streaming on internet. If you care to Google VK3AML 13 November 2021, that's Google the phrase VK3AML 13 November 2021, you'll find the visuals that go with this talk on French Island in Western Port. There are very few shells on the beaches, mainly scallops and bivalves. On the muddier beaches, one often gets the impression that the mud, honeycombed with interconnecting holes, might be the homes of some subterranean worm or mud crab, or perhaps a small shrimp. As you walk across the mud, water squirts into the air from the holes around your feet. I was disappointed to see an oil slick on part of the beach, one of the telltale signs that we were not too far from Melbourne, not far enough. All of the streams here are the colour of red wine, and they smell strange, not fetid, just odd. The sound of odd exotic bird calls is not uncommon here, and the swans honk loudly as they take to the air with a slow poetic grace. After the trek back along the beach, I had the customary sack hitting back at the tent and then lunch. In the afternoon I followed a trail up by the dams on Brella Creek. The first half is through lush, improved pasture and low scrub, taking over from fields where chicory was once harvested. Now, silent and empty they lie, waving to the wind. There are brown rabbits, or are they hares, all about in this region. After some time the track takes a plunge into some open sclerophyll forest with thick undergrowth. The soil for the most part is very clay and the drainage poor, resulting in very wet conditions underfoot even on the ridges. Rosellas, parakeets, rainbow lorikeets are to be found in the sclerophyll up on these ridges, as is the island's serious rabbit problem, wherever succulent grasses predominate. I circled back by the road around the prison farm perimeter to the main entry road. The main road is lined with low heath, pink and yellow and white, in strings like little bluebells. Rabbits are also found in this section, quite large and well fed, mainly dark brown or black. The mosquitoes seem to be a general infernal nuisance on this island, particularly anywhere near streams or swamps. This includes the whole north shore of the island. Only the ridges and the high areas seem to be generally free of them. I found several small clearings near the northern prison boundary which would be ideal camping spots, clearings in clumps of low eucalypt. Didn't sight any koalas in this part of the island during the whole trip, which I'm told is rather odd. The views of the north side of the island from the ridge top is quite magnificent and well worth the walk to see. Several varieties of wattle are to be found along these roads, laced with pretty if primitive dirt roads, and very few people on them. The two reservoirs upstream of the prison along Brella Creek are interesting. The lower one is used for canoeing, but I don't think that either are used for human consumption. I understand that the camp's water comes from a bore, high up, probably the one passed on the inland road to the Spit Point. I didn't sight any native marsupials on this trip, though the light orange feral cats and rabbits are numerous. Word has it that the potteroo is also found here, in spite of the feral cats, and while I never sighted one, and Keith, the camp commandant, has not seen one outside captivity in his 17 months here, I would believe that they might be about. The vegetation is right, low and largely open heathlands with reasonably large tracts of poa tussock along the coastal margin, alternating with tea tree. Lots of places for potteroos to hide. The pine trees, quite enormous, sown for the prison farm around 1890, have self-seeded themselves in many parts of the eastern region of the island, right up over the ridges. It seems to have also spread by the flotation of pine cones along the coast. I counted quite a number along the base of the cliffs near Blue Gum Point, where they certainly would never have been seeded originally. The pines seem to be intended and are probably growing too close together in the prison camp for their own good. I saw many trees which had lost their footings and simply fallen against their neighbour. The plantation is probably becoming unsafe for human habitation during windstorms. And an interesting point, I think a lot of those pines have been removed by the time I got back there in 2015. Back to the narrative. My tent was pitched by some old sheds on the opposite side of Brella Creek from the main prison complex, on the edge of the pine plantation. On the Sunday night particularly, I felt insecure in the wind, as the noise of falling pine cones was somewhat disconcerting, and though the chance of a branch falling on me through the roof of the tent was remote, the pines were about 60 or 75 feet high and could clobber you properly from that height. I retired to bed at 8:45 p.m. after changing a $1 note for 5 20-cent pieces at McLeod and making several phone calls from the phone box that they have here. A phone box that no longer exists at McLeod, I might add. Monday, October 2nd, 1978. I woke up to find the day quite dull, but there had been no rain during the night. The mosquitoes were the thickest I'd seen them this morning, and they had a right royal feast on me as I rolled my tent up. Rest of the morning to the time of departure was spent waiting, slightly aloof, from some high school kids who were taking the same bus out that I had to take. The sound of kookaburras was quite deafening this morning, as was a cock, a chook that is, crowing in the fowl house about 20 yards from my tent starting before dawn. The job of whisking mosquitoes away made everything a chore today. I had a brief look at the beach this morning. When the tide goes out, it reveals acres of sticky, soft grey-yellow mudflats, quite the most unattractive feature of this otherwise pretty French island. Though I must confess there is an indefinable something, a subtle feeling about French Island of melancholy. What's responsible for this I can't quite put my finger on. Perhaps it's the lack of wild and dramatic, crashingly foaming ocean beaches. It's all rather quieter here with the mangroves and the mudflats. But I would say that if you're interested in wildlife particularly, this island is unique for its closeness to Melbourne and its very fine access to public transport. Perhaps the mosquitoes are to be thanked for keeping this place primitive, for keeping people away, as the wind is responsible for keeping Flinders Island and the Kent Group in a somewhat primitive state. The camp manager, Keith Sullivan, to be contacted for further information as I want to come back here. McLeod is the largest centre of civilization presently on the island. No industries are to be found here. BHP's proposed developments of the 1960s never went ahead. Thank God. Let's keep it that way. And Please see this island if you can. It's well worth the trip and very cheap for Melbourneites to see. General impressions of French Island on reflection are of a rather uniquely isolated place, far from the pressures of city life, and of a fragile environment like the swamp environment where a foot out of place or a wall of sand breached will spell the end to the habitats of immense numbers of local animals and plants, all very fragile. Be warned that the mosquitoes are bad and that you will need some protection from them, even in the uplands. I forgot the Aerogard. Provided that you can stomach these limitations, you'll find it an elevating experience to be here on French Island, living lifetimes within suspended moments and finding universes within the smallest grains of sand. My, wasn't I poetic at the age of 24? Where did it all go? This is VK3AML with a program largely on French Island. That extract was from my visit in 1978, and it was to be another 17, no, more than that. Nearly 40 years were to go by before I went back again, 2015. I went with Steve VK3SL and Dave VK3ASE, who are my usual hiking buddies for this sort of trip, and we investigated French Island this time with a camera, video and stills, and with sound recording facilities. So now we can take you much more vividly to French Island as it is around about these days, in 2015 anyway. French Island, November 2015. To French Island, Western Port Bay with Steve Langley, 3SL, Dave Stewart, VK3ASE, Tuesday, 22nd December 2015. This shows how we got there. We actually went by car, but you can get there by train from Frankston on the regular Metrail. Get there quite cheaply. This is Stony Point Station with Dave and I having a look at it. The little rail motor that goes there. Regular service, I think 4 times a day, so it's fairly regular. That's the up line looking back towards Frankston. So the whole trip from French Island to from Melbourne to French Island can be made by public transport. This is a unique situation, particularly for an island that's wilderness area. Lots of pelicans at Stony Point, including these fellas sitting up on a pole, and if you think that seagulls having a poop are a worry, imagine a pelican. And imagine what the fish smell like. This is VK3AML with a program on French Island, and these are the opening shots that we took when we went over there in 2015. That's the main wharf at Stony Point, from which the ferry goes, and I think the ferry at this stage was about $8 each way. Now it's about $15 each way, I think. And so we took off from Stony Point Pier. There's Dave and Steve, 3ASE and 3SL. And I'll have a peek out the side of the boat here. Pardon the shakiness of the camera. These were never intended for public consumption, these videos. Looking back towards Stony Point. In those days I just had a little pocket camera which had no image stabilisation at all, as you may be able to tell. And in the 6 years since this was taken, there's a new boat quite similar to this one on the Stony Point to Tankerton ferry service. Takes about 15 minutes to get across from Stony Point to Tankerton on French Island, but what a change in atmosphere when you get there. There's Dave, there's Steve 3SL, and that's the boat, a twin-hulled device. It goes in all weathers except when the wind is above 25 knots, which is fairly hefty sea. looking forward towards Tankerton and Tortoise Head. That is Tortoise Head, the southwestern corner of French Island. There's an up deck too, but on windy days they don't allow people up there. I had to get special permission to shoot these few shots. Looking back towards Stony Point. There's a kind of a naval depot near there, so quite a few Navy ships. Looking down into the well deck of the ferry. And just coming into the main shipping channel, Tankerton on the west side of French Island. There's the skipper. They do this trip, I think, about 6 times a day, back and forth. Tortoise Head down there. The Tankerton ferry is the main passenger service serving the 100-odd permanent residents of French Island. So when you live on French Island, your day is dictated by the ferry arrivals and departures. There's also a vehicular ferry that comes in from Coronella on the other side of French Island, but it costs something like $200 each way to take your car, so only permanent residents would contemplate that unless somebody was visiting with a lot of money. Some people choose to take bikes over here, and I believe it's possible, or it was possible, to hire bikes from the general store, the Tankerton General Store, which is about 1.5 miles, about 3 kilometres up the road from here to the east. Okay, on the left you see the circle, the red circle where we came in, which is the main ferry arrival point, and we made our way east from there after the boat tied up. At this information pavilion just up from the wharf we met Lois Ayres, who in those days used to run local tours. That's Lois just behind the sign there. A little lady, I think she's barely 4'11", but she packs an awful punch, punches well above her weight in terms of introducing people to the island. She's lived there, I think, all of her life. Was born into the Easy family, and you will see.
When the tide's high,
this is Lois.
The seagrass is washed up too, and many times and the dry seagrass is washed up higher. The cars.
Unregistered.
Well, they need to be registered, but there's a little bit of it's a hard situation to live here. We all have to have a car on the mainland.
Yeah.
So having that, we all need at least 2 cars here, one for the lady to use, one for the man to use. And I'm just going to stop and move that rock or just release it first. Only do it because if you're coming around that corner, so this is the guest house.
And up there on the hill is Phil Bock's French Island Eco Inn, which is probably the best of the low-priced accommodation places on the island. They have dormitory accommodation as well as units.
Shower and toilet, so there's 4 of those, and then they have a backpacker section.
Right. Now we're driving up the island's main road in the bus, which was rather rattly, unfortunately. It's difficult to hear people properly. We're making our way east past the general store in about 3 kilometres distance. This gives you a general idea of the brush there. There's a main road to the north. There's on a bridge to the left there.
Who does the roads here?
There's the country roads forward, then it went to big roads, and now Debbie, and all those parks.
Okay.
But they have a contractor. They now employ a local person
Yep.
that has all the right equipment, all the right certificates to do the work. So now we get a much better job because he'll do the work at the right time of the year if he can. doesn't get the funding to do it when he wants to do it,
Yep.
we don't get the funding wrong.
And here you start to see the straight section of the island's main road, which bisects the island east and west. A long, long section of a straight road, all gravel, of course.
Just on the side of the road here, and it is in a few other places, and along the coast near the barge, there's a plant called New Zealand spinach or warrigal greens.
Yep.
That's something if you were lost that you could eat.
She let us hop out of the bus here to sample some of the local edible plants, a thing called warrigal greens. So she's just backing up the bus to where the plants are. We literally ate material off the side of the road, and it was quite tasty. Then we were off again, moving up towards the central part of the island, and on that hill up ahead you'll see some pine trees. The general store and post office is just behind them. This video was shot in 2015, so it's 6 years ago. There have been a few changes since then. Lois is no longer doing the bus tours. I think somebody is. Natural East Tours, I think, are doing it now.
So this is where the fire trucks kept. That's the
Local CFA.
The National Park has their own truck. And they've got
The meeting hall, the main French Island Hall. And a little bit further up, the general store. That's the local sports oval.
There's only been 4 days since 1981 that we've not been able to find a koala. Sometimes might have had to walk around 3 times. There's one.
That reminds me, koalas are in plague proportions on French Island, although they were introduced in the 1920s. They're actually not native, but there are now more koalas per unit area on French Island than any other part of Victoria, and I'm not exaggerating. They export them from here to areas that have had bad koala chlamydia to reintroduce a healthy French Island breeding group.
With a square top, that's the pinnacle.
Okay.
So for the full size of that, if you did it over another day, 15 kilometres to go.
Right. Who has the big farm on the hill?
This side,
This is your general store.
yes, you'll be able to stop here on the way back, and they make put together an ice cream. They lie the ice cream and put a chocolate top on it,
Right.
which is very yummy.
We should be there at about 2:30.
Yeah.
Lois was actually running us out to a point where we could start a hike, and the hike basically took us up a place called the cemetery track to the island cemetery. Sometimes you can learn a lot about an island and its history by looking at the gravestones. So we visited the rarely visited cemetery, which I'm told had a long gap after its last regular burial in 1968 until the 1990s when the next burial occurred, and they almost lost the cemetery under weeds. An abandoned farmhouse that originally belonged to the Thompson family called Why Worry, I think that property was. It's been aggregated with other properties. From memory, we hung a left turn somewhere here and went up past the island's only school called Perseverance School. There's one of the cattle herds on French Island. They do quite well out here. Grass grows well, even in drought times, and this was a dry part of 2015.
There's a vineyard here somewhere too, isn't there?
That's down this road, Long Point Road.
Oh, I see. Down by the coast.
The coast is to the right. They always refer to the coast meaning the south coast of the island for some strange reason.
Main road is where the olive grove is.
Right.
And they have llamas and alpacas.
For those listening, in the video we're bouncing along the main roads of French Island, all gravel, a lot of them corrugated, and we're driving in a rather rattly Mercedes bus driven by Lois Ayres, who used to run the local tours there. This is filmed back in 2015. And you'll find it if you search VK3AML 13 November 2021. That is, Google search VK3AML 13 November 2021 and you'll find our live stream.
Any foxes here?
No foxes, no possums, no wallabies, no wombats and no kangaroos.
Oh.
That's the reason why Aboriginals didn't live here, because there was no meat supply.
And here we go left
So
up
that's
towards
the hill. Once
Perseverance
you
School.
ride up, you might as well ride down.
Yeah.
The white on the top of the bush there.
Makes you realise how big the island is when you look across fields that big and you're not in sight of the sea. It is that big. Coming up to Perseverance Primary School, I think, somewhere here. There's the school.
And that's the school, presumably.
All self-powered by solar cell balls, please note.
Teachers come over on the ferry in the morning and go back and then the
Perseverance School is one of the few primary schools in Victoria that doesn't have a minimum student number limit. So in actual fact, the students at Perseverance on French Island have a greater share of good facilities than most state schools.
To go to a honey farm or something.
They bought that property and so they're living up there and just, working in the store.
Uh-huh.
So now, yes, they collect the honey and sell that in the store.
Soon after rounding this turn, Lois dropped us off to do our walk up the cemetery track. We're actually on what's classified as a secondary road on French Island here.
Certainly a contrast to Phillip Island.
I'm thinking as to whether we might do it a little different and then you could get to go to...
And this is where we
That's the
hop
track
off.
we were going to come down, wasn't it? When we were walking. The cemetery track?
Yes.
And off Lois
And off
went.
she went.
And we were due to meet up with her after doing a big loop up through the cemetery and through the centre part of the island just to see what it was like. Hot day.
That isn't the fork there, is it? That isn't the fork there, is it? Yeah. No mosquitoes, but the bush flies are pretty bad. Okay.
And we have our first echidna. Just nosing around. Bumble, bumble, off into the bush. Bumble, bumble, bumble. And the Banksia and sheoak were interesting species that I don't think I'd seen before. There is a tremendous special diversity here, it having been largely untouched.
Good spot to do a bit of video.
Here comes Dave, 3ASE.
The cemetery track, French Island.
And you can see where the cemetery is. A little square at the end of that red line on the left there is where we're actually walking up from Mosquito Creek Road, where Lois dropped us off. And this is Boot Hill. This is the cemetery at French Island. There's the earliest grave, 1895. And lots of these names, Thompson and Easy. There's a couple of Thompson graves there. Families that are still well represented on the island. Ethel Easy, the Easy family, the Tuck family. Going back further, I think the Chilcotts, who are commemorated in several place names around Western Port. There's one of the Chilcotts there, Mary Chilcott, I think, going back to the turn of the 20th century. Some of the graves are better attended than others. Mary Wetherell, who died in 1924. We wandered from grave to grave looking. There's perpetual flowers under a glass dome there, which has been left untouched, obviously, for decades and decades. And a young bloke who died tragically young is in that grave on the left. French Island Cemetery.
And this is Boot Hill, French Island Cemetery, right up there.
We then walked north to this junction, and by this time it was 11 a.m. We were surprised to see a motorcycle.
It's quite a view from here. You can see down there to the east. To the east. Not much habitation out in that direction, except there are people with trail bikes, of course. But here, we're by the stockyards at the north end of the cemetery track.
About to get attacked by barkies by the sound of it.
There are fields on the northern part of French Island all around here.
And this being 11 a.m.
going off in all directions from
this
here.
being close to 11 a.m, Dave was tuning into the 160 metre coffee break. And there's Laurie, 3SJ, all the way from Healesville.
You can see how our volley comes through compared to Laurie.
Oh, he's pretty weak.
Yeah.
Anyway, Laurie, you're being heard on French Island by 3ASE and 3SL, and we're in the middle of French Island, the north end of the cemetery track, covered in bush flies, waiting for the first snake attack.
Koala View. You have to say it out loud to realise what it means.
North end of the north end of the cemetery track. We're looking there at the north end of
that's the north side of
Western Port Bay.
Western Port, looking towards Tooradin.
That's east, and that's the direction we're heading.
Quite nice farms out here, but they're very remote. There's no electric supply, there's no sewerage, of course no gas. I'd be surprised if there was telephone wires, but there would be mobile coverage here. And then we went on, being great scroungers, to the French Island tip, just to see what was down there, looking for radio chassis, but all we found was a car in slight need of repair. Then back down south along a road towards Lois's home, which is the location of the Bayview chicory kiln, where Lois would service Devonshire tea, and we had a good pause for lunch You'll see in a moment there's Lois picking us up on her Mercedes bus. And the Bayview chicory kiln where Lois Ayres and her husband Keith live is where I'm marked with an oval at the end of that road there. They're partly powered by wind power, as you can see. They have all sorts of collections of historical material here.
Keep the morning tea.
Right. Not to mention farm animals everywhere. And these fellas. There were so many of these koalas up trees, it was hard to know which one to shoot first. By shoot, I mean with video. And they were all completely stuffed.
All tuckered out.
He's having a sleep. There's another one. Not very active though. They seem to be perpetually zonked on the eucalyptus leaves. How much can a koala bear? It's an old pun. And I think we're about to see the thong gate, which you'll see in a moment. Lois doing a guided tour of her farm at Bayview. There's our bus. And there's the Bayview chicory kiln, I think built about 1900. Retained for historical reasons now, although they no longer produce chicory. Chicory apparently was a coffee essence. Couldn't get the taste of it myself. I thought it tasted awful, but apparently some people develop a taste for it. And this is the interior of the chicory kiln, which is partly in ruins as a result of an earth tremor back about 2010.
A bit ago,
Oh dear.
when there was an earth tremor in the South Gippsland side.
I remember that was concentrated at Wonthaggi, I think.
You've often seen these on the side of the road and wonder what they look like inside. Has it become much of an income?
And this is where we had lunch.
As the short answer is,
Right,
because we've only got 50 acres, so we've only
It's
got...
nothing, is it?
No, we've only got 11 cows and their calves.
A quick view outside. They have the tail of a crashed aircraft there. Occasionally aircrafts come down on crash landings on the island. And the Bayview chicory kiln. I think this was built by a member of Lois's family, either that or her husband Keith, way back, turn of the 20th century. And the dog kept barking at me. Heading in for lunch. Where are the boys? There are the boys. It's Steve, 3SL, with his back to us. I had a quick look around the historical displays here. Anybody who wants access to any information on anything historical or geographical, it was on view here at the Bayview chicory kiln. There's Steve with the local dog. Dave.
Evening.
And there's our Devonshire tea on the table. That's one of the hoppers that brought the chicory in for drying. And Lois took a photo of the three of us together, Steve 3SL the left, Dave ASC in the middle and myself on the right. 2015. And then we moved south. Lois took us on the Mount Wellington Road down to its intersection with Tankerton Road, and we walked that blue line down to Long Point. So down this road was the point at which Lois and we parted company to walk on the rest of the way to the coast, the south coast of the island, and have a look at the coastal scenery there. Trying to get a steady shot of some of the passing farms. It wasn't easy with a little point and shoot camera that could only barely do 1080p in those days. My more recent camera is far more sophisticated in its image steadying. So if I go back there again, and I intend to this coming summer, the results should be much steadier than the video you're currently seeing.
Ferry comes in from that side.
Right. Oh,
And we hopped out and walked past some very attractive farms, though very isolated. That's looking across to Phillip Island in that direction. Long Point Road, this is called. And it was a very warm day, I think about 26 degrees C. So we were sweating quite a bit. Another one of the very attractive farms on the south coast of French Island. Quite a few Cape Barren geese around. This is a panoramic shot I took from one of the high spots we were at. Left side, looking directly south. Anderson Hill on the left. That's looking across the various sand dunes, sand spits across towards Rill and Phillip Island. Dave and Steve ahead of me walking down the hill towards Long Point. Then you hop over this stile and you're at the beach, and that blue track down the bottom there is the track we took along the beach. We walked a section of the south coast of French Island. There's a abandoned wharf at Long Point that you can see there. Most of the coast was mangrove growing in mud. Rather squishy stuff to walk through. Another abandoned pier if you look at the piles there going out. I don't know what this was. An unusual rock formation, or maybe it was a dinosaur turd. We don't know. We tried to keep to the firm part of the beach, the sandy part. There was a lot of river mud, mangrove mud further out. And quite a bit of wind on the beach, as you can probably tell. The Anderson Hill in the background, near San Remo. And by this time we'd walked quite a bit of the coast, and we were having a lunch break. Stephen found this wrecked boat in the middle of nowhere. We never worked out where it came from, still had part of its motor in it. And this is Mrs. Neesham. She gave us the directions to find our way back to the road, because none of the roads actually come right down to the beach. Dave with an attendant collection of bush flies. Seems that on French Island you have a choice of bush flies or mosquitoes depending on where you are. Looking south to Rill. There are quite a few sandbanks in the middle of Western Port Bay. It must be very difficult to locate and navigate the channels. You'd have to know what you were doing. Steve indulging a flight of fantasy and thinking, should I move here? We didn't. And this is looking down the Centreway, I think the name of this road was, coming up to where the Tankerton road was. By this time Dave had collected a big collection of bushflies, as we all had. We were at this stage walking back down towards the general store. Lots of wildlife about. This abandoned house called Why Worry was originally a place occupied by the Thompson family, now abandoned. And then we heard a koala serenading his lady fair. Aren't they romantic? A voice that only a koala could love. Hello. Two of you. You're serenading your lady love, I see. And he was. Anyway, we made our way back to the general store for afternoon goodies. And from memory, we flopped down on this sort of a pier outside. That's actually built with the remains of a previous Tankerton wharf. And there's that phone box I talked about in my earlier visit. They were very close to the French Island Hall, where all the social events go on, and then we walk 3 kilometres down to the departure point. But first we had a couple of drinks at Phil Bock's establishment, the former Tortoise Head Lodge, now the French Island Eco Inn. And there it is, along with one of the bush buddies in front of it. There's Phil Bock, the proprietor of the establishment, and it's a very good dormitory accommodation which Peter VK3AML has availed himself of. Looking south to Tortoise Head. back view of French Island Eco Inn. And that's how close the Eco Inn is to the departure point, only a 250 metre walk to the ferry. And so we departed. The same way we came. By this time it was the last ferry of the day, I think close to 6 p.m. Slowly turning the boat around and heading back to Stony Point.
It's a bit, yeah, exactly. It is, and there's nothing I can do about it because it's just happened. I think they'd like to shut it down. They would. They'd like to shut down every rest of the system. Very, very popular. Here and then on the sun. Sweet. They have time to wait.
Coming into the Stony Point wharf. The oil refinery is further up, I think, at Crib Point. Dave shooting some video on a Kodak. Stony Point itself is worth a bit of a walk around because of the large number of birds that gather there. I think the pelicans gather there because they're used to having the guts of fish thrown out by fishermen that arrive here. They keep the beach clean, but at the moment, 6 p.m, they were about ready to have a snooze, so they pull their heads in. A convenient sort of a pantographic head assembly, most of these birds. Tortoise head across on French Island from Stony Point. In about 7 minutes I will open it up for a QSO on 147.475, but first I'll give you an interview, a radio interview with one of the residents of the island. If I can find the clip. One Clive Gordas, who was a prominent member of Landcare.
On the largest island off the coast of Victoria, there are over 200 bird and 600 plant species. I'm not talking about Tasmania. I'm talking about French Island. It's only accessible by water and home to just 100 people, which, coincidentally, is about the same amount of orchid species that bloom on the island. It's only about 60 kilometres or so from Melbourne, right in the middle of Western Port Bay. It's a haven for flora and fauna, as Clive Gordas found out when he moved to the island with his wife, Faye. They used to work rehabilitating bush sites around Melbourne and were amazed by the diversity of species. Jenny Henderson spoke to Clive Gordas when she recently visited French Island.
Right at the moment, it's just so fertile. There's reproduction going on everywhere you look. The insects are everywhere. It's just wonderful. It's just such a healthy place.
If we stop for a couple of seconds, you can even hear lots and lots of bird calls in the air. They're just filling the air at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. When we first came to the island, it was a bird place. The bird observers used to come, but very little was known about the flora, and that started our interest in looking at the flora of the island. At the time, there was only about mid-30s orchids known. Well, we've looked ever since then, and the orchid list now is about 110 species. It also holds a flora which has disappeared from certainly around Melbourne, the heathlands.
What type of environments are on the island?
Well, it's an island for a start, so it's circular. So each part of the island faces a different part of the compass. So naturally, in every little niche, there will be things that only grow in that niche. The blue gums, for instance, they only grew on the eastern side of the island, and apparently blue gums like facing east. On the Hastings side of the island, there used to be, or still is, an extensive network of swamps. They grade into wet heathland, comes around them. That grades towards the centre of the island. We're at the centre now. It begins to rise here, so this is a heathy woodland.
As you mentioned, we're standing on your property at the moment, and you've just pointed out an orchid at our feet. Maybe we should go for a little bit of a walk and see what other plants we can find.
Well, before you go, there's the grasses. The grasses are a feature. Anyone that comes to visit the island will go along the fire breaks, and the fire breaks are where visitors get access to move across the island. The fire breaks opened up a whole new level of ecosystem for things to grow. That's why the orchids have proliferated, the grasses, and they gave all of these little things that don't get a chance other than after fire.
What are some of the species that are really doing well on the island?
Oh, without a doubt, the orchids. They love the open areas. We get the chance to watch colonies of orchids grow. On the mainland, they're watching them retreat. Here, in the natural world, species are trying out new ground all the time. And more often than not, the species are successful. So the orchids here are colonising new ground all of the time.
And just interrupting, I'll be opening it up on, this is VK3AML testing, I'll be opening it up for a QSO in about 3 minutes' time. This is an interview with Clive Gordas, a former resident of French Island, talking about the diversity of flora there.
The fact that the island's isolated from the mainland plays a part in its unique ecosystem?
Without a doubt, it was more difficult to destroy for a start. If we had have had a bridge, people would have been able to come and go. They would have been able to bring superphosphate easily. They would have been able to bring new species of grasses. They would have been able to bring weeds. And until the mid-60s, there wasn't even a reliable barge. So it made it very difficult to farm. So that's protected the island.
As we're sort of heading down to the back of your property here, we're coming into a bit more dense bush. What are some of the species that you can see here?
The tea tree's flowering. This is Banksia marginata. The tea tree's gathered over since about early September, where there's 4 species of tea tree. They flower one after the other, and they culminate about mid-October, so that the whole landscape is covered with a sea of white. Underneath that, we slowly get the peas kick in one by one until again about the same time. Mid-October is about tidal wave of colour hits the bush here, with what the locals told us when we first came they call summer snow, and it's really appropriate. It's not snow, not summer, but it's snow-like.
And as you look out into the bush, you can see it sort of peppering, the white colour peppering through the bush all through as far as the eye can see, really.
And little white dots all over the ground as well from the petals that fall off them.
Over your years here, especially working in bush rehabilitation, have you noticed any pests that have tried to take a foothold on the island and may or may not have succeeded?
About 4 or 5 years ago we had cup moths. And cup moths are a really interesting, pretty little caterpillar that's green with dots of colour on it and little stingers on them. And they love the leaves on the eucalypts, and they defoliated almost every messmate on the island, and it was a real worry. In the end, it righted itself. They died off when it began to get cooler in autumn and the trees grew back their leaves. You need some repellent.
We've just stopped, and for a second I've been engulfed in a cloud of mosquitoes, and they are a feature of the island and probably something that's kept a lot of people away. But what are the significance of the mosquitoes to the ecosystem here?
Well, the grey fantails for a start. You'll stand still and the grey fantails will come up and pluck the mosquitoes right off your face. We've got a really healthy bird population. Birds love mosquitoes. And if you take the mosquitoes away, it will unbalance our ecosystem. One of the features of the island is the variety, the genetic diversity of the species here. They will range through all shades, all colours, whereas on the mainland, because the population is restricted, a reserve is only so small, you'll get one particular colour of plant survives in that reserve, and they tend to think, well, this is the colour of the species, and then they see it as another colour here and they think, oh, it must be another species. It's not at all. It's as nature intended it.
What do you love about its diversity?
Oh, I love it because it's natural. It's the way it should be.
Clive Gordas, a former resident of French Island, I think he now lives up the Wimmera somewhere, but talking to Jenny in a radio interview about 6 years ago. And that brings to a close the coverage of French Island. It was an area that Peter 3YE, Dave 3ASE and Steve 3SL and myself all really love, partly because of the interesting untouched natural environment so much on Melbourne's doorstep and so accessible by train and ferry, and partly also because with the lack of reticulated power there are no power lines, no generators, nothing sparking except perhaps for home independent power units. It's free of static. It would be lovely to have a remote SDR over there, wouldn't it? And it would be fairly easy to connect back into Melbourne. Anyway, this being VK3AML, it's now 11:09 PM. I hope that we'll have some people on call back. I'll flip open my book of words, ready to take down any call signs. So, having started and finished a little late tonight because of a problem with audio, the audio actually failed on our first attempt to connect to internet via our normal software, and I think it may have had something to do with the fact that I tried to stream in stereo. I went back to mono and it's been great ever since. You tell me, we'll both know. Or maybe it was just that there was a heavy loading on internet. Anyway, with that, I'm calling CQ. This is VK3AML calling CQ on 147.475 and standing by for any calls.
VK3ACZ. VK3ECG.
Okay, we've got VK3ACZ Peter and VK3ECG Dave. Nice to hear you both there, and I hope you didn't mind me deviating a bit from the usual technical stuff to go on to what more is kind of like a travelogue of past visits to French Island. And I must admit, now that the lockdown is finished, I'll probably be planning another trip. I was talking to Phil Bock, who owns the French Island Eco Inn at Tankerton, and they still have a few bookings available for January, more available for February, but I'll certainly make an attempt to get across there when time permits. I'll take Peter first. VK3ACZ, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. How's your week been, Peter?
VK3AML in the group from VK3ACZ. Good evening, Chris. Good evening, Dave. The usual crew back. Been a fairly good week, but comments about the presentation first. On the technical side, you seem to lose the audio on your 147475 broadcast as well, or at least as soon as the YouTube picture got trouble, I turned my little handheld on and there was nothing coming through there either. But my broadcast froze while you were passing the school, and I waited a minute or two, and then I got back into the YouTube thing, and it never faltered. I just be interested to know if Dave's froze at the same point or not, or whether it was just my internet connection. But anyway, why your broadcast was so relevant to me tonight, Chris, was in May 1977. I was one of the lucky people that did the National Fitness Council's youth leadership course there. I don't remember how I ended up going. I also don't remember coming back, but everything he was showing me was a trip down memory lane, trying to remember exactly what it was like or what I was doing. And unfortunately, the old memory bank has lost an awful lot of the content of that. I can remember we stayed in the prison officers' dormitories, which were 6 bunk rooms, which made me think that I wouldn't like to have been a prison guard there. The Mozzies, yes, concur with that completely. I have never known Mozzies to be more ferocious anywhere I've ever been in the world. The worst swamp I've ever been to didn't compare with French Island. Rabbits, you had to see them to believe them. They were rotten. The place was rotten with them, and the caretaker at the prison farm there took us for an outing in his little van there one evening. He had a Browning A5 shotgun, and when he got sick of popping off shots at bunnies, we were encouraged to go and chase them on foot, which I did. And while the rabbit was distracted by the headlights of the Jeep, I ran up alongside and grabbed hold of one, and I was aiming for his back legs, and because he slowed down, I grabbed him around the neck and promptly got scratched quite a fair bit by the back legs. Serves me right. The one other thing that I will never forget was a pine cone falling on my head, and all the young ladies and everybody laughing at my expense. Why is it that people laugh when you hurt yourself? I don't know, but certainly a nice little laceration on the top of my head, which bled a fair bit. But yeah, kind of reminds me, funniest home video and all that stuff. People do laugh at others hurting themselves, so there you go. But yeah, I remember the trip down there in the old Walker rail motor. I note too that I saw the picture there that you had of the sprinters that run up and down today. I used to fuel some of those sprinters. Took 1,300 litres of diesel. But anyway, as I said, a nice trip down memory lane, and thank you for presenting it to us. Enough waffle for this over. Back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
VK3ACZ and group VK3AML. I can't detect any lost frames on the second try. On the first try we simply lost sound, and nothing short of rebooting the program would bring it back, so I had to interrupt the stream, erase the stream, and then reboot, and that whole process took about 5 minutes, so we ended up beginning, instead of at 9:30, at something like 9:45 or 9:47. So apologies to the people who tuned in and found confusion and or a silent stream. I obviously was trying to push the system too far. I decided to make it stereo sound rather than mono, and came a cropper. I don't know why it failed, but that's the first time I've tried to stream stereo and it wasn't successful. So obviously I was exceeding the transfer rate or something like that. But I can't detect any lost frames after 1.5 hours of streaming, so it can't be too bad, and it may be the connection from America or wherever they route this stuff after it's live streamed back to Australia. There may be interrupts there. Okay, on to Dave, VK3ECG. And how's your week been, Dave? I think I saw you last on Cup Day. VK3CG and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and VK3ACZ. Good evening all. Yes, it's been an okay week, as they say. I was actually pretty busy. I was trying to take Thursday and Friday off, but at the end of the day I only managed to really take Friday off. So, but it was, well, as one would expect. The rain was coming down, so in fact it wasn't so much of an issue because I couldn't really get out to do various jobs that I wanted to do. We had a couple of trees down with the storm a week or so ago, and I've cleaned up all the branches, but there's still a couple of the actual main trunks still lying there, wedged into other trees and things. So that's a little bit of a job to do. But I very much enjoyed the video and the talk. I loved your language in the diary. Yes, I can remember writing things of a similar ilk when I was of a similar age. And I'm trying to think what I was doing in 1978. I was at university still, actually, and I think I was just in the middle of my my course, and I took a sort of a year in the course but out of the course, if you know what I mean, to do a sort of a science thing. And I worked on lots of things related to asbestos at that time, so that was what I was doing in 78, actually looking and digesting bits of lung and extracting asbestos from them and looking at that. So that's that takes me back to those sort of things. But yeah, absolutely. And the other thing, going back to those sort of experiences, I'll tell you my pelican story, which is not my story really, but a friend of mine, one of my best friends at medical school, went on to do orthopedics, and he did some research into I think fractures in pelicans from the zoo or something like this anyway, and he was x-raying pelican legs or wings or something. Anyway, he always told me the story of how he was confronted by a pelican in a sack in the laboratory, and they were going to x-ray something or something like that, and his supervisor disappeared, and he said, just get the pelican out and we'll sort him out, etc., etc. Anyway, he sort of opens the neck of his sack, and this pelican's beak shoots out and starts snapping around all over the place, and he's fairly hesitant to do anything with this pelican. He's trying to get it out of the sack, and there's a lot of struggling for the pelican, and he's equally having difficulties. Whereupon his supervisor comes back and said, what are you doing mucking around with this sack? Just get the pelican out. And he said, I can't. He keeps fighting me. And he said, oh, no. He said, just stick your arm in. And he stuck his arm to the sack, and the pelican just latched onto the arm with a big beak. Whereupon he just drew his arm out with the pelican hanging off his forearm, wrist, hand, and so on. And so there we are. It's easy to get a pelican out of a sack. So that's my understanding of how to deal with pelicans. But I'm not sure I'm quite brave enough to do that either. But there we are. But obviously a fascinating place, and I've never been. And it sounds like I need to make a trip there sometime. It sounds like a sort of place where you'd want to take a little sort of folding e-bike or something like that to, or an ordinary folding bike for that matter. I'm sure you could take that enough on the ferry as sort of a backpack type thing, and get around as well. Although the walks were clearly lovely. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML group VK3ECG.
VK3CG and group VK3AML. I'm just leaving a pause there in case anybody'd like to break in. Now let me see, what can I comment on? The storm damage, we've only just discovered that the next door neighbour had a tree which blew over, and what we didn't know until today was that the roots of the tree had disturbed the stormwater outlet to the main drain in the street, and with all the rains we've had, basically underneath his house is a lake about 6 inches deep. Fortunately they have concrete block supports, not wood, so rot is not a problem, and dampness rising is not a problem. But the problem for me is that that reservoir is draining out through the soil, coming up through cracks in my driveway, and actually little sprinkles of water are gushing up through the cracks in our driveway, potentially undermining it. So we've had all sorts of emergency drainage people coming out here, sorting out the neighbour's problem, trying to work out where the stormwater drain is, because recently they repaved our road, and I've got a feeling they blocked off their stormwater outlet into the gutter. It never should have been into the gutter, but apparently it was. So a little bit of damage next door. I'm just feeling a little bit sorry for the people next door. Storm damage. Asbestos, yeah, bad stuff. I'd be interested to hear whether asbestos has a similar effect on the lungs as long-term tobacco exposure, in that is it like COPD, or does it produce effects like lung cancer? How similar is it to excessive smoking? Is it worse? Is it better? Is it quantifiable? As far as the evil animals are, the birds particularly, I have a friend, well, my late best friend's daughter, Rosie. Before she trained as a GP, she trained as a vet, so she's doubly qualified. And at veterinary training school, which I believe is at Werribee, where she did her training, they had to fix protected animals that for which the government would pay for any veterinary bills if the animal was found ailing. And somebody came in with an ailing, wait for it, emu. And in my friend Rosie's words, although she's quite a refined GP, she said those things are effing, and she didn't use the word effing, evil. She said, have you seen the size of claws those things have? They make dealing with buck kangaroos look like child's play. And she had to apply a rectal thermometer to an emu. There are not too many people that can say they've done that. As for French Island, in terms of going over there, I've seen several people going over with mopeds and bikes. The main roads, they're quite feasible. They tend to be gravel or slightly corrugated, but there are a lot of secondary roads there where really you would have to put the bike to one side and just walk, because there's sand tracks with potholes occasionally, and you can go A over T in a bike with a pothole like that, and you would be so remote from any human habitation that it might be weeks until they find you if you're badly injured. So best to take a mobile phone to call for help if you need it, but be very careful of where you drive the bike. The main roads are fine, but there aren't that many main roads. And Peter, you probably would have been trained by Keith Sullivan, who was the National Fitness Camp's director when I was there, and that was in January 78. So if you were there in 77, sorry, it's October 78. So if you were there, I think he said he'd been there 14 months, so he probably would have been the director while you were there. He was a former policeman, I think, very much into fitness, of course being a National Fitness Camp director, but a very genuinely nice guy. And, he gave me a lot of advice in that trip through to the camp, allowed me to put up my tent for nothing, which is better than I can say for any subsequent owner of the former McLeod prison farm. It's gone through several reincarnations since then. It became a permaculture farm for a long time, but under its former management tended to run down. They took out all the pine trees that used to be a feature of the area, so that now that area is bare. The old, very substantial wharf pier that used to run out from Freeman's Point at the old prison farm was demolished after it became unsafe, I believe in the 1990s. It was not there when I got back in. Well, I visited briefly on a bus tour with Prue before we went back with the boys, 3ASE and 3SL, and that would have been about 2008. And by that time the wharf had gone, the pine trees had gone, and the old prison farm was slowly succumbing to concrete cancer, so it's not in great nick. But about 4 years ago it was sold to a new owner, who I don't know, who had plans of making it Chinese tourism destination, though how Chinese tourists would react to that number Bushflies and mosquitoes is anybody's guess. You have to take the good with the bad. If you're into bird life, flora and fauna, and if you're prepared to put up with a bit of the nastier side of the bush, namely bush flies and swarms of mosquitoes, it's the ideal place for you. And as Clive Gordas said in that interview, if the mosquitoes weren't there, there wouldn't be so many birds eating them, smaller birds, finches and such. VK3ACZ and the group, VK3AML.
Yeah, with a short pause for anybody else wanting to join us. VK3AML and the group from VK3ACZ. Well, yes, I've certainly been scarred by the mosquitoes. That is something I can't forget. I don't remember any of the staff there at all. I remember a couple of the people that that we did bits of the course with. Can't even remember a lot of the course. It's just funny. I'm struggling to remember. I know we got off a rickety old ferry and there was a green old army bus to collect us, to take us over there, and the ferry wasn't capable of taking a bus, so I did wonder how that got it there on the island. I know there must have been that general store there, but I don't remember it, and so on and so forth. The pier, oh yes, remember that fondly. I was sorry when you mentioned in the broadcast that was gone, because I sat out on the end of that one evening and watched a massive electrical storm to the south in Bass Strait. Couldn't hear it, it wasn't that close, but it was still a spectacular fireworks show, and it was just wonderful. I thought it was a nice touch in the video there where you were listening to the coffee break net on that little, what looked like a commercial radio receiver. A nice touch there. And you get better reception than I do. I must do something about a good antenna for listening on 160, because even a couple of the broadcasters in the Knoxfield area come through very, very low signal with me, which must be an antenna-related problem. But anyway, again, I'm going to spend a lot of time after watching all that wondering why I can't remember more than I actually have. But of course, yes, you'll never forget the pine cone falling on the head, of course. The trip down there, I remember them exchanging the electric staff, which is that tubular piece of metal with the station names engraved on it. Couldn't work out why they were doing that with the driver. It was quite a few years before I found out about staff and ticket, as the safe working system was called down there on the Stony Point line at the time. And just a bit of UBI for you, Frankston drivers actually were qualified on the V-Line Sprinters just to run that service from Frankston to Stony Point and back up to Melbourne to change over the Sprinters for fueling and servicing and all that stuff. But so appreciated you seeing it. Sandra had more of an idea than I have about the place, because she went. We're members of a bushwalking club, and a year or two ago they had a walk down there. So she fell asleep halfway through your broadcast. No offence intended there, but I'll be interesting to pick her brain about what she remembers about French Island. I didn't want to talk while the broadcast was on because I was too busy listening to what you were saying. But anyway, back to you. My next over, I might tell you what I've been up to as far as DX is concerned this week. But back to you. And I'm interested in what Professor Dave will say about lungs and asbestosis and all that too. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
VK3BLX.
VK3BLX, nice to hear you there. You might like to take it for an over. VK3BLX, VK3AML.
VK3AML on the group, VK3BLX. Yes, good evening everyone. Evening Chris and Dave and Peter. I did watch most of your presentation tonight, Chris, and I found it very, very interesting actually. There's French Island, been sitting there in the middle of Western Port, and I've really never paid it much attention. Sort of knew it as the site of the old prison farm, but really nothing much more about it. Never realised it was a go-to place if you want to meet mosquitoes, but apart from that, it sounds like it is really quite an interesting place with quite an interesting history. So, yeah, I found that quite fascinating. I watched most of it on the big TV too, because most of the video you had there was pretty good quality. It looked good, extra good. I didn't notice any disruption to the video at all when your audio
failed, but I probably wasn't looking all that closely. The video seemed to be going fine, but the audio just disappeared. So, yep, whatever that was. Also on VHF. So, what the link is between your the feed to YouTube and the feed to your VHF, I don't know, but the audio went dead on both. Yeah, just listening on the side there. Dave, I think your little story about the pelican there, the pelican in the sack, I think the instructor had it all worked out, didn't he? How to get the pelican out of the sack. Step 1, find unsuspecting student. Step 2, it's all done. And the emu, the poor lady having to take the emu's temperature. Gosh, I had this image in my mind of somebody standing with a thermometer taped to the end of a broomstick, but I'm sure it wasn't done that way. Anyway, back to you, Chris, VK3AML, VK3BLX.
Yes, well, I know that two people held it down while a third stuck a stun, tranquilizing injection into it. I don't think they had a stun gun or anything like that. But emus can be quite threatening. I once was at Tower Hill at, this is in the 70s. I didn't know much about emus, and I thought there was just one there, so with one it was okay, and I was fairly tall, and the emu would treat somebody that's taller than it themselves with some respect. And I had a bit of fruit, I think it was an orange or a bit of apple or something for lunch. I offered the emu it, and he swallowed it, and you see this lump going down the neck like something out of a cartoon. The trouble was, apparently that emu made some sort of a noise that called another 12 emus, and they all sort of emerged out of the scrub like something out of a horror film. And to get into the car, the girl that I was going with at the time had a Volkswagen, so for somebody my height, 6'3", having to crouch down to get into a Volkswagen, of course, as soon as you crouch down, the emus think that they're the dominant and they will attack. So I never have got into a Volksy or screamed, "Get out of here!" to the girl faster than I did that day. I barely got out of it with myself intact. But they can be very threatening. So can kangaroos for that matter, but mostly during the day, particularly hot days, kangaroos are sleeping, emus are awake. That's the problem. Okay, I'll hand it over to Dave 3ECG, and I will be intrigued to see whether asbestosis relates to COPD or lung cancer or something similar. How it relates, if it relates. VK3ECG and group VK3AML. Sorry, I'm picking your brain.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group VK3ECG. Oh yes, well, lots of things there. Yes, I mean, I was actually quite interested in the fact that Peter was able to verify the danger saga of the pine cones, and yeah, absolutely, we have lots of pines here, and when they do fall out of the trees, they come out with quite a bit of force and roll down the block and so on. But I suppose it's better than the issue with coconuts. They are somewhat heavier, and apparently can do quite a bit of damage. And certainly have been known to result in a few fatalities actually. But there we are. Yes. Oh look. Well, asbestos it's a nasty substance at a number of levels, and there's all different types of asbestos, and they have different propensities to cause different types of damage actually. So blue is different from white and brown and so on and so forth. And but the primary problem is a fibrosis condition. Was in lung fibrosis, and that's the sort of long-term debilitating condition. But they are associated with an increased risk of sort of more traditional lung cancers, and in fact that's additive with smoking actually. And they have their own special particular tumour they cause, which is mesothelioma, and that's a tumour of the lining of the chest, and covering of the lungs. So it all emerged really in the sort of knowledge base, really in the early parts of the 20th century, and it's quite an interesting sort of historical story, because there was a very famous man who wrote a book on the pathology of tumours. I think he was a professor of pathology in Leeds, and he had sort of pontificated that this was such incredibly rare tumour as a natural tumour, that all these people reporting it so commonly and people working with asbestos must be wrong, it must be something else, and he poo-pooed the whole notion of mesothelioma, and he was later proved to be wrong, largely because of the vast numbers of cases that were coming out of South Africa with the mines there. And then there were a whole variety of other places around the world where, when they actually went to look at what was happening to the sort of people who lived there, they found them having high rates of this tumour. I think it was a place in Turkey called Asbestos, a town which was had major asbestos mines, and that was sort of again where they started to realise these things. And the other great place was Canada, was a big place that manufactured white asbestos particularly, and there's a big sort of argument in the literature about whether asbestos, white asbestos, caused the same cancers as the blue and the brown and so on. So it's certainly an interesting story, and it's more to do with the physical properties anyway. So there are other types of so-called fibrous clays and so on, which probably have the same sort of propensities. But it's quite an interesting historical story. There was a collection actually of lung tissue from I think it was at the old London Hospital, and they had a collection of lung samples, I think going back to the sort of 1870s, 1880s or something like that, and they were in salt barrels in the basement of the hospital. And somebody thought, when sort of asbestos was becoming more prevalent, particularly after the sort of asbestos sort of diseases were starting to appear after the Second World War, they sort of said, well, let's have a look and see when asbestos came into people's lungs. And so they'd had lots of samples of people who'd had various lung pathologies over the years, and then they went back and found these lung tissue in salt barrels, and they processed all of that to see, and they could actually pick up, as the Industrial Revolution took off, they could actually pick up how and when the asbestos started to appear in specimens going right back. So it's a really interesting story. But the problem with the mesothelioma stuff is that it can take up to 40 years post-exposure before you start to develop the tumour. So again, that time interval creates all kinds of interesting issues around proving causation. At least in the early days, it did. But there were some fascinating stories that came out in relation to the Second World War, because again some of the gas masks used asbestos wads in the gas masks, and it was the military ones rather than the domestic ones that used it. And the reason I got involved was because I was in Nottingham, and the Boots, the pharmacy company, and of course the retailer of the pharmacies in the UK, at that time Boots, the chemist's factories, were used to make the gas masks, and they employed a large number of women to actually just pack the gas masks, and they were actually able to see whom had made what and what diseases they got, and that was the sort of one of those sort of early links to a group that they didn't expect to get asbestos-related disease, and whereas people who worked in the docks and shipping and in the industry, they did. So it's got a really interesting piece of sort of medical history about it, and social history as well. So fascinating stuff. Sort of my sort of experience of being on small islands and stuff like that was actually Norfolk Island, and there are certain sort of similarities, although Norfolk is a very different sort of place, and doesn't have really that sort of the swamps and the mangroves and things like that around it, but also an incredibly beautiful place in its own way. I'll just think of the other little notes I'd had. Oh yes, and sort of a lot of my childhood was spent up in on the Norfolk coast, and Blakeney and places like that, with all the sand dunes and navigating the channels and things like that, which were fascinating, because the whole place would just be surrounded by huge mud flats off the coast, and then when the high tide came in, it would all disappear, and yeah, you'd have a few sandbanks, and then eventually they would disappear. But it meant actually trying to sail a boat or row a boat or whatever across those areas made it very, very hard, because if you didn't do it at exactly the right time, you get stuck high and dry until the next high tide came in. And that being sitting out in a dinghy on a mud flat for hours on end is not the best thing to do. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML on the group, VK3ECG.
VK3ECG and group VK3AML. Yeah, it's. I mean, I don't think there's an equivalent of the mangrove in England. I guess it's far too far north, and I know that the largest mangrove area in southern Australia is Western Port Bay. I think there are mangroves in Tasmania, but not to any extent like that, the north side of Western Port Bay. It's north side of Western Port Bay, particularly to the northeast of French Island, is almost pure mud. It drains to the point at very low tides that it looks like you could walk across there, but you couldn't. You'd sink into the mud and stick. It's like quicksand. I think that's one of the reasons they put a prison farm over there, because Western Port Bay is populated by a lot of fish, which brings a lot of sharks. And if you don't get taken by the sharks, you'll stick in the mud. I think there are only 1 or 2 successful escapes from that prison farm in the whole time it was open, from 1916 when it opened first to 1975 when they closed it and converted it to a national fitness camp, which of course is the situation that I struck when I got there in 1978 and wrote that diary. Actually, when I went back there on a bus trip in 2008 or thereabouts, and as we drove into the old McLeod prison farm on that return visit after 30 years, I said, "Oh, good heavens, the pines have gone and the wharf has gone." And a woman turned to me and said, "Were you a prisoner here?" And I thought, God, do I look that bad? So I was careful who I told I'd been there before and when after that. And obviously you went there at the same time, Peter. Ultimately, I don't think the National Fitness Camp was successful once it got around how many mosquitoes were there. I think they gave up on it. The Keith Sullivan, who ran the National Fitness Camp, told me that they'd tried aerial bombing of the mosquitoes with some sort of anti-biting insect stuff, DDT or maybe, I don't know. They'd brought in crop dusters to try and reduce the population of mosquitoes, and it was totally fruitless. As soon as the local mosquitoes had died off, the ones from the mangroves further north would come in. So they were part of the food chain, and there was nothing you could bloody well do about it. The same applies to Warneet at the north end of Western Port Bay and Quail Island, which I believe are lousy with mosquitoes there too, near Turridan, which is the reason you don't hear too many people going to take their boats to launch at Turridan. It's usually they take it round to San Remo where they're out of the way of the mosquitoes. VK3 ECG, VK3ACZ I think is next in turn, then VK3BLX, VK3ACZ and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group from VK3ACZ. And good evening, John. You're 50 over 9 with me in Baronia. You must be up the top of the hill in Mont Albert.
all good, glad to have you aboard. And yes, the mosquitoes, I know it's the third time I've mentioned them, but that was definitely the most unforgettable part of the whole trip, the whole time there. They, I thought, were the perfect punishment for the prisoners. I don't think they had an easy time of it on the island. I don't remember seeing any mesh over the... they were all in single rooms, well, single cells, I should say, but I don't remember seeing any mosquito netting anywhere. But just to be middle of the day and be swamped with them like you would normally with flies was just something not to forget. And you're mentioning the doing the rectal thermometer trick on an upset emu. Wonder why he'd be upset. But it kind of reminded me of talking about talons and all that, and being worse than a rampaging kangaroo, which I can believe. I had cause to pick up a koala and put him in the passenger footwell of my car one time because he'd sat by the side of the road and hadn't moved. And when I picked him up, put my hands under his shoulders, he showed me the most compelling reason to treat him respectfully when, you know, the claws were well and truly ready for action should I get myself into an exposed position. By the time I'd driven him to a local vet's, he was, and had spent nearly an hour in the car, he was much more placid, and in fact he was the life of the party when they put him on the examination table, and he was rubbing his head against the chest of the vet nurses and that sort of thing. He became a little character. I'm so sad that the story didn't have a happy ending, because they x-rayed him and found a break in his spine, so he got the dream, the green pentobarbital dream, unfortunately. Most undignified end to a beautiful critter. But I forgot too to compliment you on your prose there with your diary readings. That was rather crafty and rather pleasant to listen to, I must add. And Dave, you mentioned Norfolk Island. That's one of the places I visited this week on the 20-metre Anzanet VK9 Delta X-ray. Nick came up and shared a bit of time with us all, and boy, propagation was good, because he was about 20/9 with me, and he gave me the same report, and virtually everybody else in Australia, you know, from VK6 up to the top of VK4, all were passing and exchanging 5x9s. But anyway, just a quick word about propagation, not to change the subject, but to let you know what I've been up to this week. When the CQ Worldwide contest was on, I feared that the recent solar storm that we'd had with the massive aurora and all that might have been the cause of some brilliant propagation on 10 and 15 metres. Well, I needn't have worried, because 10 metres has been opening to Europe on voice a bit. On Monday, I had the privilege of working 086RM, 300k north of Helsinki, and Sierra Papa 5 India Tango in Poland. Really good copy on 10 metres. Fantastic stuff. And I've been hearing, I heard a G station. I did the snail mail version of FT8, because he was calling CQDX, and I could hear him, but he couldn't hear me. So I popped an email over to him, and 10 minutes later got a reply with a thank you for the signal report. And I just like to think that it's, as I said, the slow version of FT8, but there you go. My contact of the week, though, was 4 Sierra 7 Juliet Lima, a Sri Lankan fellow who was on a container ship called the Nordamelia. It had just gone through the Panama Canal heading west over towards New Caledonia, and he was running 30 watts into a vertical, and had a pleasant exchange with him. So DX-wise, 20 metres has been up to its usual standard, but the fact that around about sunset, 10 metres is opening to Europe goes pretty well also. Enough rambling for this over. Back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Sounds like it's opening over the poles if you're getting through to the north part of Finland with OH6RM and Poland. And good on you getting that Nordamelia container ship bloke. I'm surprised that they'd allow amateur radio operators on container ships, so I suppose they must have shifts on those things going across the Pacific, and there must be time where they have downtime. they can't work them all the time. I know that shipping unions are fairly strong in that direction. I'm just... John 3BLX, in terms of the computer link, the reason there was a long pause with nothing going out was that I was trying to find something that I could do to rectify the sound problems. I was fiddling with the computer, changing every preset that I could find, but no, the sound had failed and it just wouldn't come back unless I rebooted the whole system. So my concentration was on the computer probably longer than it should have been. I should have I'll know in future to just close the stream for about 5 to 10 minutes, do the necessary restarting of the YouTube, and do it that way. It reminds me to change a few things when that comes around. Anyway, I'll hand it to John VK3BLX to take. And what else did I want to comment on? Oh yeah, it's surprising, Dave. There are some people that choose to still live in Wittenoom when there are warnings on people not to go near the place. There actually are residents there who've chosen to move into houses that are worth next to nothing because nobody else will live in them. And they've got dust there too, which I wouldn't like to be breathing. VK3BLX and group VK3AML.
VK3AML and the group VK3BLX. Yes, Wittenoom. I have been there a few years ago when we were travelling through the Pilbara, part of the country. We drove out to Wittenoom and then drove out from the town toward the old mine site. It gets a bit hard to get out there these days. What looks like a nice, good quality bitumen road suddenly turns into washaways and, almost impassable in places. Just amazing how quickly, what appears to be a well-constructed, good, solid road just falls victim to the heavy rains and floods and things, and without regular maintenance, it just disappears in places. But we got out to where there was, big piles of tailings full of blue asbestos. It was sort of quite interesting. Didn't go quite all the way to the mine site because there was a pretty fierce-looking thunderclouds we were building, and I thought, if they break over here, I might have trouble getting back through those sections of destroyed roads. So we sort of called it a day and headed back to town. But of course, the town, of course, is just a grid of squares where houses used to be, with just a handful, half a dozen houses still standing. When we were there were a few long-term residents who didn't want to move. I don't know whether there are any folk who have moved in more recently, but I got the impression it was the sort of place that people would go who wanted to get away and didn't really want to be around too many other people. Certainly a couple of the people that we came across were unusual, shall we say. But sort of interesting place to visit once. Try not to inhale too much, I guess. Luckily it wasn't windy or anything, but couldn't resist getting out and having a bit of a poke around and have a look at what all the fuss had been about. Your diary, Chris, I must say you were a meticulous recorder of everything that you saw and experienced, and a rather poetic turn of phrase here and there. I'm wondering whether you were in the literary sort of pursuit part of the organisation, or whether you were in the technical part of it in those early days where you were. Sounded like you could have been in the editorial area, but now, I wonder. What else we got here? Mosquitoes. You're saying mosquitoes are a part of the food chain. Well, those poor prisoners, when they were sent down there, they might not have realised that they were becoming a part of the food chain as well, and not the top predator as it happened. So, oh God, I'd hate that. I would absolutely hate it. The mozzies love me. I don't know how I'd ever put up with it. I'd have to be covered in Irrigard every minute of the day, I think. on sirloin to mozzies. Curiously, my father was never affected. They didn't bother him, and he was in New Guinea during the Second World War, and he said guys around him were getting bitten like hell and coming down with malaria, and they just didn't seem to touch him. At least he never, came out in itchy lumps or contracted malaria. So, unfortunately, that was a biological characteristic that didn't pass down to his son. Quite the opposite. Norfolk Island. Would love to have got to Norfolk Island, mainly because we got to know a little bit about it due to a neighbour that moved in next door to us when I was just a kid of about 6 or 7 or something or other. We got new neighbours, a lady and her 2 children, and she turned out to be a direct descendant of Fletcher Christian, who had moved over from Norfolk Island, I think probably so the kids could get a decent education in Australia. Husband, I think, is deceased. And what we learnt from her was that it was a place that would certainly have been worth a visit, but I think in those days the transport costs were pretty prohibitive, and when I grew up and had a family and all the rest of it, same thing applied, and probably about now I could afford to go, but I don't know whether I'll ever get there. It was an interesting connection though. Actually, when her daughter grew up, she went back to Norfolk and I think became the magistrate on the island. So they certainly continued on their connection with Norfolk. Peter, I'm just wondering what sort of gear you use. I gather that you escape from home and you've got a little spot up on the hills there where you do your DXing from. I think I heard one night when I was listening that you get a lot of QRM from your neighbours from your home location. I think you said due to some sort of horticultural endeavour they've got going, but you might, I don't know what you can say about that, but I'm interested to know the gear you're using for these contacts anyway, because you're obviously operating portable, and it sounds like you're doing really well. That's great. Okay, back to you, Chris. VK3AML on the group, VK3BLX.
Come to think of it, I've never asked Peter what he's using either. I know what Dave's using because he brought it along on Cup Day to the Cup Day gathering. I shot a video of that too, which I think I showed last week. I only wish that I had the 4K very nicely stabilised video back in 2015 when I shot the French Island stuff. I've been so embarrassed by the shakiness of that French Island video. This is the first time I've ever shown it outside the family. In fact, you were asking what was I doing in the ABC. Originally I trained in electrical engineering. I didn't do the full course. I did 2 of the 3 years. It was a diploma, not degree, at Swinburne. I actually pulled out of my own volition because my father was dying of cancer and I had a choice of spending time with him or doing a fairly heavy amount of the course, and I really wanted to spend some time with Pop. I was 20. He died just 6 weeks before my 21st birthday. We were close, and I don't regret interrupting my schooling at that stage because that would have given me training for an electronic manufacturing industry, which at that stage, with Whitlam coming in and dropping import tariffs, was ceasing to exist. So that my only outlet, had that happened, would have been something like a telecom technician, and that's not something that I really wanted to do. So one of the last conversations I ever had with my father, about a month before he lost consciousness and then died a couple of weeks later, this would have been at the start of 1975, he had been tuning about on a transistor radio in his hospital, literally on his deathbed, and came across the first test transmissions of 3ZZ access radio. And he said, son, you've got a good voice and you've got a turn of phrase. I've seen some of the stuff you've written. What you should do is get involved with that access radio station, and if I'm in a fit condition, I'll be listening critically. My father was a school teacher, and so I said, yes, Dad, I'll do it. And sadly, he died before I made my first radio program, about 5 months after he died, at 3ZZ, and I used that as a stepping stone into the ABC. So poor old Pop never heard me do any of that work, but eventually I was doing basically documentary work in part of the ABC radio called Special Projects. It was in the St James building in King Street, I think. It was about a block away from Broadcast House in William Street, with Das Cassidy and Richard Brown and Julie. Oh God, I've forgotten all their names. But it was called Special Projects, but in actual fact it's better known now by its term Radio Talks and Documentaries. And what I've done through the years, I suppose, is just keep notes on everything, and or sound recordings and or video. And it's only with the development of YouTube and the YouTube live stream that it's been really easily possible for me to distribute this stuff, to give it any sort of an airing, which is really, I suppose, what these Saturday night sessions are intended for. What I try to do is to put up material on a given subject, and usually I have some collection of stuff relating to that subject, and then see what sort of a discussion it produces at the end. And with that, I'll hand it to Dave, VK3CG. That gives you some idea of my motives, VK3AML.
Yes, with little pause. VK3ECG. Yeah, it's fascinating. I've not, as I said, I've never really done much in the way of direct sort of work in terms of producing bits and pieces, although I've got involved with quite a lot of TV and film type activities over the years, often as a sort of technical advisor for various shows and things like that. And a couple of years ago I had a little morning stint for 5 minutes sort of every week on the breakfast program on 774 and so on, which was quite fun to do. Everyone's always interested in some sort of weird forensic topic, so you can always find something that keeps people amused. But the fun thing has actually been involved with productions in relation to fictional TV shows. I was did a thing with Channel 10. It was with when they did the TV show State Coroner years and years ago. And helped with scripting and storyboarding, and actually in some of the shoots as well. I think I appeared as an extra on one occasion, but most of the time I was just helping the actors with various scenes that involved my work, and so I would sort of just sort of coach them on a particular bit of the scene to make it look authentic and things like that, and which was quite fun, and helped the arts department every now and then get the right sort of bottles or the right sort of bits and pieces, and make something look like a human brain that wasn't a human brain and things like that. It's amazing what you could do with sort of low angle shots and things like that to sort of conceal things. And then occasionally I've done things with films, and again helping actors with various bits and pieces on series and so on. Well, I did some sci-fi thing once, which involved an alien autopsy. Now that was fun, but then of course you could do anything you like in something like that. So, but so there's been a few sort of fun occasions, but quite a lot of it's been working with writers, so that they'll be writing a scene, or they want to achieve X, Y, and Z, and you throw in some ideas around what else they could throw in to wrap the story up, and use some technical thing to link it together again. So you've got to keep it entertaining. It's no good. You just can't have things absolutely true all the time. I try to get much truth in it as possible, but at the end of the day, it's got to be entertaining, or they just don't want it. So it's an interesting balancing act, but quite a fun one. So I've always enjoyed doing those sorts of things. I was just thinking, what else was the mosquitoes thing's fascinating. I've got some of those nice nets on which you put around your hat and so on, which seem to work quite well. Actually quite good for the sort of bush flies as well, actually. But Yeah, but when they're out to get you, my normal trick is to stand close to my daughter because she attracts them all over the place, and then they keep away from me then, which is always a good thing to do. I noticed actually, Chris, looking at your the diary, it looked as if you'd been writing in fountain pen. I wonder if that was the case. Always nice to see people actually using fountain pens, but there we are. Anyway, back to you from VK3ECG.
VK3ECG and the group VK3AML. Well, I often write in fountain pen. There's a good reason for it. I dress to disguise an osteopathic problem that I've had since I was an infant. I contracted osteomyelitis as a baby in the crib. And from another baby, it's a viral disease that gets into the bone. The other baby in the adjoining crib died. This is in 1954. And the only way they could get rid of it from me was to aspirate my shoulder as an infant newly born. And the result of that is that my upper right arm has never grown. I'm just showing this on the video stream. And the right arm, therefore, is a little weaker than the left. The shoulder is malformed. And I can't rest my right arm, which is still the writing arm, on a desk to write cleanly and legibly. The only way I can write legibly is if the device I'm writing with has a reasonable degree of friction against the paper it's writing on, and a thick nibbed fountain pen is one of the few ways I can produce halfway decent handwriting, which is why a lot of my older books I'm using fountain pens. These days it's actually difficult to get fountain pens, particularly the cheap type. You can buy the expensive presentation type, but God, I don't want to have something made of gold. I want to have it made of something durable. And the body can be plastic. And I used to use, what do you call them, inserts, cartridges. Still do when I can, but the problem with fountain pens is frequently they leak, and especially if you take them in aeroplanes where the cabin is pressurised, that can be disastrous for shirts, as my wife has found on occasions. But yeah, I write in fountain pen, and the reasons are purely facile. Hand it to VK3ACZ. Oh, and I envy the Norfolk Island stuff. A number of friends of mine have gone for holidays there. I've never been, but everybody who's been there recommends it, even though the island is very small. I suppose, looking at it in terms of bang for the buck, New Zealand being the size that it is and the range of latitudes that it exists in has a greater range of attractions from the tropics to the snow. And always New Zealand is cheap to get to, relatively. So New Zealand's won out so far. And my regards to Sandra too. I'm sorry that the thing put her to sleep. I just hope it didn't put too many people to sleep. I know it's a little bit off the ham radio topic, but I thought that the change would be as good as a holiday. Now, I think I hand it to Peter, VK3ACZ, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group from VK3ACZ, and I didn't mean to say that to imply anything about your show. No, she's an early riser, so she carks it very early every night. She'd have loved to have stayed on to see the French Island footage just for comparison with when she did a bushwalking there. But anyway, a couple of things. Oh, I just had a brush-tailed possum outside the window here chucking a bit of a tantrum, and it kind of reminded me a lot of the audio you picked up of that koala in the tree there on French Island too, and boy, don't they make the most amazing sound compared to their otherwise cuteness. But there you go. And I couldn't help but think of
no wonder Peter Parker's gone over there using the place as a good DX location. It'd be very attractive because of the lack of QR Mary. And in answer, speaking of that, yes, John, in answer to your question, I do have noisy neighbours. You do not believe in the death penalty except for people who grow hooch and wreck the HF bands. But even when they're not actually on the job, it's still noisy enough here. Once you've experienced HF out in the bush with absolutely no noise, it's very hard to go back to suburbia. It's just not the same, and that's part of the reason why I go portable. I put up a squid pole. The simplest, easiest antenna I've got is an NFED, 1 in 49 unnin. I haven't bothered with a counterpoise. I hammer an earth stake into the ground, and it seems to work pretty well. I've got two NFEDs. One's 136 feet long that tunes nicely for 80, and the other one is 40, half-wave at 40. What does that make it? Half-wave at 20, sorry. So it's 40 metres long. Is that right? Oh, whatever. And I'll alternate between the two of those. And I can't claim any great credit for what I do. I've only got 3 countries left to work in Europe. That's Latvia, Moldova and Montenegro. I've visited all the others, but only because long path in the afternoons, 20 metres absolutely goes gangbusters. It's just fantastic. 20/9 signals for at least 2 hours every day. And the funny thing is, when the band swaps over, when it flips over after 12ish, sometime or other, short path to Europe's never so strong, or hasn't been in my experience thus far. But anyway, going out portable with the 100 amp hour battery, the ASU 891, which has been put in second place just recently because I had a 7300 follow me home from the toy shop. The idea there being that I benefit from a much better band scope, but it's the fact that I can use such primitive gear and get 5 nines and all that from Europe just says how good propagation is, and can't wait until we get the couple of years time when the sunspot cycle's even better for the higher bands. Although if it's anything like that CQ worldwide contest was, it might be a little bit crowded and therefore wearing. And one other thing for this over, Dave, you mentioned state coroner. Funny you should do that, because I've just ordered from Crawford the Wendy Hughes series state coroner. So I'm going to be looking forward to seeing your contribution to all of that. And I know you said that you had to mix entertainment with factuality. Yes, I know there'll be no waiting 8 weeks for lab results for toxicology results and that sort of stuff, will there? It amazes me how everything happens so quick in the Hollywood type entertainment world. And I did meet Wendy Hughes just the once. She appeared in a movie, can't think of the name of it now, but she was a prostitute selling her wares between Sydney and Melbourne on the Southern Aurora train. And my contribution to that movie was that I was on a locomotive at early hours of Sunday morning when they were filming, and we just had to move a couple of carriages up and down the platform occasionally to give the appearance of movement. And the thing that I remember most, apart from meeting Wendy Hughes at 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning, was that the catering van is very, very elaborate and quite swish for the actors and the film crew, and you just have no idea how many people are involved in filming these things until you see the whole production team. Back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Oh, I've rarely worked on a feature film, I think only once or twice. But I know that film, I think it's called Strangers on a Train. I'm not quite sure. I've actually seen it. I wasn't aware you were involved. I'll certainly have another look at it. Wendy Hughes, I used to see, Prue and I subscribed to the Melbourne Theatre Company for a couple of years, and she was in a few of the plays there, including Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. And that would be about 12 years ago. She's passed on now. I think she died about 2015, something like that. From memory, she was a fairly heavy cigarette smoker, and that may have taken her out early. I have nothing against cigarette smoking. It's just that it's killed so many people who are friends or people that I've loved or members of my family. My father died of it. Tony Sanderson, 3AML, died of it at the age of 61. Lionel Curling, 3NM, died of the effects of it age 61, and here I am, 67. I'm glad I didn't succumb to the temptation. I certainly was there socially, but I took one puff of a cigarette once and thought, this tastes like shit, and never went back to it. Maybe I just bought the wrong brand. And I must ask next time around, Peter, what do you tune your 136 feet end fed with? Do you have a balun? Do you have an ATU? Exactly what? And do you take it out portable? Round to VK3 BLX. Always nice to have you there, John. And your input is appreciated. VK3 BLX and group VK3AML.
VK3AML and the group VK3BLX. Well, it's nice to join in. Not that I have a great deal to contribute, but it's always nice to have a little bit of a rag chew when the opportunity presents itself, and you're providing us with a great starting point with this video material. I wouldn't be too worried about the shaky video because the actual content was what I was paying attention to, and the fact that it might have been a bit shaky here or there, I sort of was hardly aware of it until you sort of mentioned it. So, no, the material is interesting, and all the rest is peripheral. Okay, on your sort of career path there, from a truncated engineering degree to the broadcast field, well, you know, it sounds like it's worked very nicely. Sad that your father passed away when you were still so young. I was a bit older when Dad passed away. I'm thinking of Mum and Dad actually. I was only early 20s when Dad passed away. Also, possibly from the effects of smoking. He had been a fairly heavy smoker for a long while. He had given it up, but it was cancer that got him in the end. Now, whether it was due initially from that, I'm not really sure. But I was never tempted to take it up, thankfully, and I don't think I missed out on much. Oh, fountain pens. Look, when I went to school, we had to learn to write with a steel nibbed pen dipped into an inkwell, and it was a skill that I never really mastered, so I hated it. I was more expert at putting, large circular blobs of ink regularly across the page rather than a gorgeous flowing copperplate hand. So I would have to say that the migration to the ballpoint pen was one of the happier moments in my life, I think. I'm still permanently scarred from having to deal with that horrible steel nib. The X, that sounds like 20 and 10 metres is jumping. I'll have to have a bit of a listen in the afternoon. I take it that's sort of later in the afternoon. Peter, you might tell me when the best times are. I might come out and just see what I can hear. I've got a very ordinary G5 RV strung up between the trees, but it's certainly worth having a listen anyway. I came across my old call book, probably the second call book I ever had, and it includes my transition from being 3ZTO to 3BLX. And when that happened, a friend lent me an FT101, FT101E perhaps it was, and I'd acquired a trap vertical from, I think it was a deceased estate, plus I had probably the same G5 RV I'm using now at a different location. And gosh, when I look through that call book, just Europeans and, Russia, and just page after page. Those were the days. Wouldn't it be nice if it came up like that again? Well, it sounds like at least it's periodically the bands are performing from your description, Peter, so I'd have a bit of a listen. Once the novelty wore off after a year or two, I never really did that much with DX again. I sort of prefer to be able to have a bit of a rag chew or discuss some, technology that I'm frantically constructing with like-minded guys. So DX, it's every now and again I like to get on and just see if I can actually be heard somewhere, but it's not a big thing for me. But it sounds like you've been doing fabulously, Peter. All but 3 European countries. That's really terrific, amazing. I'm most impressed. Anyway, back to you, Chris, VK3AML, and the group VK3BLX.
Yes, I agree, John. All but 3 European countries is very impressive, particularly as I think Peter's done it all with voice, not FT8, or any of those sub-noise level systems that basically can work by remote control. So is that the case, Peter? I won't hand it back to you directly. Yeah, but the fountain pen, purely because of the friction of the nib on the paper, Dave, I can write with them much better than I can with biro. Just to give you an idea, I'll flash this up on the YouTube page. This is how scrawly my handwriting is when I use a biro. I can't keep in the lines of the exercise book. I sometimes I have trouble reading my own writing. But if I have a fountain pen, it's a totally different story. VK3ECG in the group, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML on group VK3ECG. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I do use fountain pens, and I did for quite a long time. And then when they started producing all these sort of copy paper, where you have sort of 3 copies, and not sort of the carbon paper ones, but the sort of chemical ones. The trouble with fountain pens is exactly the advantage for you, and that is you need such little pressure to produce a really nice line. There's a nice shape to them as well, and certainly much prefer writing with a fountain pen because of the no pressure really required to produce a nice line. But of course, once you get these copy sheets and copy papers, then you've got to have pressure to get the chemicals to react and make those sort of copies. And I've found myself filling in so many of these things on sort of, request slips and things like that it became almost impossible to write with anything other than a biro and so on. But I still have quite a few fountain pens. Actually, I inherited all my father's old fountain pens, and that started me off on a little bit of I'm not a serious fountain pen collector by any means, but every now and then I'll look on, I see something on eBay and something like that, and then I dismantle the pen and get it and sort of refurbish it a bit and clean them out. It's amazing, people sort of say, not working properly or whatever, and all you need to do is actually get some, distilled water and just basically clean them out. And once you clean them out, many of them work absolutely fine. The difficulty is people have had them in drawers for, full of ink, and they've just dried out there, and they're very, very just very, very dirty, basically, with lots of sediment. It takes a long time to get some of that out, actually. And sometimes I soak them for days just to get the nibs right. But the ones I really like are the Parker 51s, because they had that hooded nib which didn't dry out in the same way, and they're excellent pens. And the 75 I quite like as well, which doesn't have quite the kite nib. It has a sort of a rolled nib around a sort of a cylinder, and it's much more stable and much less prone to damage, and again doesn't dry out in quite the same way. But there are a lot of Chinese companies now remaking the with steel nibs, the old Parker 51s, Hero or some sort of name like that. And I remember I saw something on eBay, and I think for $9 I could get 12 copy Parker 51 fountain pens from China. I got them, and see what they were like, and I kept a couple, and I just gave them a rest away to friends who said, I've never ever written with a fountain pen. Couldn't believe it. So I used to just give them a fountain pen. Well, have a fountain pen then. And it only cost me like $1.50 this fountain pen. So and they were quite impressed, quite a few of them. They're absolutely fantastic, and I must say I really do enjoy fountain pens. Yeah, I remember Wind Hughes. I remember I was on the set of State Coroner quite a lot for the shoots actually, and did various things with Wendy. I remember I took my daughter along once to the to shoot just to see what happened, and that they let that. And Wendy spent quite some time chatting to her and stuff like that. She was really very nice, and I wouldn't work particularly closely with her because she was playing the coronial role, and I was mostly helping the sort of pathology people. No, it was a very nice group actually, and. But you're right. I mean, the food wagons are absolutely amazing, particularly if you've got those long shoots on away from the sets, the elaborate level of moving into some sort of deserted premises. I remember, I think they were getting rid of Prince Henry's Hospital some years ago. They used, for one of the series, they used the old kitchens as a mortuary room, and we sort of helped them sort of fit them out a bit, and for a particular show, and it was quite fascinating. But it must have cost them a bit of money to have something being shot at the weekend, because they really have to hit the overtime very heavily once they go anything out of sort of ordinary hours and things like that. So. Occasionally they shot at our building actually, and for different shows, and they nearly always have to start at sort of 5 in the morning, so they're long gone before the main staff arrive, and they'll do anything to actually not do shooting at the weekend, because it just is so costly from a production point of view. But it is just fascinating, the number of people there, and as soon as anyone wants to take a photograph, because they take lots of stills on sets as well, of course everyone has to shout, live flash, whatever, because otherwise the lighting people think they've lost a bulb somewhere every time a flash bulb goes off or flashlight goes off on someone's camera. It's fascinating. Back to you, Chris. VK3AML and group VK3ECG.
Yeah, I think the sort of things that I've had to do has been much more to do with documentary filming, particularly historical documentary. Early in my career I was working mostly in radio. Later in my career I worked largely in research and scripting and stills research and sound recordings research, particularly for historical documentaries. Worked a lot with Film Australia in the early 80s, in Lindfield in Sydney. So I saw quite a bit of Sydney in the early 80s. And that seems to be where most of the film companies had their headquarters, with the exception of Crawford's, and Crawford's was more into fictional film making and television series, so I was never involved there. A few girlfriends were. One particular girl, Veronica Sweeney, came down and stayed with me when she was doing auditioning for a mini-series called Sarah Dane at Crawford's, and Crawford's at that stage were in Middleborough Road in Box Hill, I think. Before that they'd been in Abbotsford, from memory. Abbotsford when they were doing Homicide and Consider Your Verdict in the 60s, if you're old enough to remember either of those. Yeah, I'm just looking down the list here for what else I can comment on. It's coming up for midnight, so perhaps we better start thinking about winding up. Sunday is my day of rest, getting away from video editing. I will have to admit that this week, because I had to reassemble with that diary, I had to assemble suitable pictures for wherever I could find to illustrate, and finding stuff to illustrate a diary, usually stills, you can't cover as much material with stills as you can with movie footage, and it vastly increases the amount of work in video editing. So I spent rather more time than I would have wished. Next week I'll probably dig in more to my New Zealand material, specifically stuff that I shot in Auckland, the Museum of Transport and Technology particularly, which was one of the most impressive museums in New Zealand, particularly for early radio equipment, going back to the days of Marconi's magnetic detectors and the involvement of a New Zealand scientist named Ernest Rutherford in the development of that. Not many people know that a New Zealander, Ernest Rutherford, was behind the theory of a lot of Marconi's early developments. And they celebrate Rutherford appropriately in the New Zealand archives. Yeah, okay. And Peter, I don't think you've answered yet. Do you use a balun or tuning or step-up transformer to feed you a 136-foot end fed or the 40-metre long version? And do you use tuning, an external tuner, a non-automatic tuner, when you go portable? VK3ACZ and group, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group from VK3ACZ. Yes, well, I was describing my portable setup before with the end-feds and the squid pole and all that. And I don't know. Funny thing is, my little auto-tuner for the 891 will tune the 20-metre long wire for 80 metres, which makes it an eighth wave, which really surprises me. In fact, I wouldn't have thought it would radiate all that well, but I've had some, I got into the USA, into Arizona a couple of weeks ago for the first time ever, and the main problem with that, I suppose, is that you normally hear most of them above 3,800, but we won't go into that. But I'll just quickly, my notes that I made here, the reason why Wendy Hughes was out at 2 o'clock in the morning was the only time the film crew could book out all of Spencer Street Station, because the entire car park at the time looks totally different now, of course, unrecognisable, but the whole car park was filled with their huge equipment vans and catering truck and all the rest of that stuff, and their little tarp that they had up with all their food tables and such like. Quite flash. Agree with you about the was never tempted with the habit that what I call horse manure wrapped in tram tickets. Agree with John about the shakiness aspect of your video. It's a home video. It's not a production that we're watching on the huge silver screen, so it all fit in with the atmosphere of it all. And too much DX is never enough. I keep saying that. John, if you listen on 20 metres at around 1800 hours, it's as the season's changing. It's getting a little bit later for the long path to really open up and go gangbusters, but from 1800 till about 2000, at least 2 hours, you'll hear all the European long path that you could shake a stick at. And one other station I worked, which I was rather proud about this week, was my first South Korea contact, mainly because I get killed in the pile-ups, working barefoot. But there's so much around, so many strong signals at the moment. 12 months ago I was getting massacred in pile-ups, not so much now. It's pretty easy to make contacts. And I will look forward to next week if you've got anything about Auckland. Love the place. I just let me know if you're going to be up the Auckland Sky Tower, though, and I'll take a couple of Valium to prepare myself. I really didn't handle the Sky Tower, especially that bit where you can stand on the glass and look straight down. But beautiful view, but just suddenly don't like heights anymore. But anyway, back to you, Chris. If we're going to wind down, I'll say my 7-3 to you all. If we're coming back for another over, I'll still be here. But anyway, back to you, Chris, and thank you again for the broadcast. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
VK3ACZ and group, VK3AML. Yes, I did shoot some stuff up Sky Tower. And we went out to that volcanic island in one of the harbours. Rotamatunga or whatever it was. Gosh, it's so long ago. It's about, 2017, I think we did that. that was the last trip when I was using the Panasonic camera, which really wasn't up to much. After that, I got the Sony AX53 camera, and my God, the amount of image stabilization that thing has, combined with fully optimized 4K, the quality, even when it's cut back in editing to 1080p, is really just leaves the others for dead. That's one of the reasons I want to go back to French Island to reshoot some of the stuff that I wanted to shoot with a lot better quality and a better zoom lens for the wildlife, and automatic focus that jumps into automatic focus quicker than previously. The other problem that I had with the Canon and the Panasonic, which I don't have with Sony, is a problem with frame rates. I don't know what Sony's done with their coding or their frame rates, but it interfaces far better to internet than whatever frame rate the Canon and the Panasonic are using. There's notable interframe blur that occurred tonight on the French Island footage. One frame will be completely clear, the next frame will be a combination of two frames and it will be fuzzy, the next frame will be completely clear, and if you watch it closely it's very annoying. So I wasn't entirely happy with the quality, which is why I've never put the stuff up, really. But I do need stuff to fill the Saturday night gap, and what I want to do is to get out with the camera and interview a few interesting, particularly older amateurs. I also wanted to interview Peter VK3AML, but he doesn't seem terribly enthusiastic. I think he's too busy building his own website and YouTube channel, and good luck to him for it too. The Aurora, yes, I was expecting better DX, and obviously you tell me it's working that way. Around to John, VK3BLX. What was I going to say? There was something there. And to Peter, sorry, to Dave, I was thinking those tissue samples of lungs could go back to, if they go back to the 1870s, that's the sort of period of Frederick Treves and the Elephant Man. Interesting period in British history. The Whitechapel murders and all that sort of stuff. I wonder if you, Dave, have a theory on who Jack the Ripper actually was. Not that anybody can probably tell at this distance in time. I'll hand it to John, VK3BLX, perhaps for a final, and I'm starting to want to get desperately to the loo, but the video stream doesn't allow. VK3BLX and group VK3AML.
VK3AML and the group VK3BLX. Yes, I'm just about ready to call it a night and head off to the cot. And I certainly wouldn't want to keep you from the loo, Chris, so, I'll make this very short. I don't think I've got anything much to add. Just, interesting evening, and look forward to catching up again next week. And I'll definitely have a bit of a listen and see what I can hear from the other side of the world, Peter. Get the HF rig percolating again. All right, well, cheers all, and see you in a week. If all go. Oh, wait a minute. No, I won't see you in a week. I won't be here. I've got an annual get together with some friends. We have a bike ride up around Port Punker, Bright. So yeah, that's what I'll be doing next Saturday. Hopefully, what's today? Saturday. We'll have survived the bike ride, and I'll be happily ensconced in a pub somewhere. Well, I will have been. All right, cheers all. VK3AML and the group VK3BLX. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I don't know whether you saw, but about 2 weeks ago on this Saturday session, I did a walk around of some of the biggest motorbike museums I've ever seen, including the one with the world's fastest Indian, the Burt Munro collection. and they're all at Invercargill at the south end of New Zealand, of all places. I'm glad I got some good 4K video of that with a new camera. In fact, I bought the new camera for that specific trip. Don't regret it either. So, for a final round to Dave, VK3CG, and Sir Frederick Treves and all. VK3CG in the group, VK3AML.
Yeah, I did see that broadcast of yours, Chris. It was fantastic, actually, and I thought the trucks were really interesting too. But my bike riding weekend will be done with pedal power, I'm afraid. Okay, go ahead, Dave.
Oh, you're that sort of bikey. Okay, over to you, Dave.
Okay, fine, from VK3CG. Yes, there's some fascinating specimens. I think if you get a chance to go to the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in London, you'll see some extraordinary specimens. And the other place I actually really enjoyed as a weird medical curio museum was the Students' Museum in Vienna. The medical students have got essentially got a museum, sort of part of the university complex, but it's actually in one of those old towers, I think defence towers, circular place, and they have all these rooms with sort of wax models of various things and old skeletal remains. And it's an extraordinary place, and well worth a little rummage, seeing all the old treatments and the old systems that were used and things like that. And so yeah, there's some fascinating stuff still around actually, and some amazing waxworks that were done not just of people but of diseases, which are also really interesting to see. Yep. So I was just trying to think the Jack Ripper stories, that they're fascinating, and of course there's multiple theories backwards and forwards, including a person who was actually hanged at the Old Melbourne Jail, and who was at one stage thought might have been Jack the Ripper and had escaped, but I think we've pretty well proved that was not the case. So there's a lot of really interesting sort of historical stuff going on around those things. Yes, and yes, I was certainly when the Crawford thing. It was certainly it was a Middlesbrough Road where most of the stuff was shot for state coroner, which I presume must have been, I can't remember when it was now, into the 90s or something like that. And that was certainly really interesting time, and it's amazing how they take this huge space and just basically fit it out with all these different rooms. So the courtroom and the offices and the mortuaries and all that sort of stuff are all part of just moving walls around. All of a sudden you put a couple of walls together and it's a completely different place. It's extraordinary seeing those sort of things work, and the actual exercise of going everything from an idea all the way through to a storyboard, all the way to a breakdown, and then the scripts and so on, and then directors sitting down with the scripts and working out how they're going to do it, and the arts department. It's actually quite fascinating, and I'd never realised how complex it actually is and how many people are actually involved. It is really a friend of mine who actually works in the insurance business, and she was lost amusing story for the night, but she was did a lot of work actually insuring various productions and indemnifying them and things like this, and she worked on a project called The Long Lunch or something, and she used to have to put in her book where she was going when she left the office, and she just write down The Long Lunch, and of course no one was quite sure whether she was just going out for a really long lunch or not. But on that note, I'll leave you all and wish you 73s, and hopefully catch up again next week. Don't think I've got anything else exciting on, but you never know. 73s, everyone. Anyway, VK3 ECG off and clear. Cheers.
Yes, look, for goodness sake, don't feel obliged to be in every Saturday. I'm not going to feel obliged to be putting up video every day, every Saturday, but I'll certainly do as many as I can, because I have some pretty vast archives, as you may have gathered, of videos I've never put together properly. I think that applies to a lot of people who shoot videos. They shoot videos with the intention of editing them into something that other people can watch and never get round to it. And I've been doing that for nearly 10 years, to my horror. Around to Peter VK3ACZ to tie the ribbons, I guess, if you're still there, Peter. And please, best wishes to Sandra. And I hope, well, the stream is recorded as a by its nature, and so it'll be available hopefully in perpetuity, unless there's some slip-up I've made with copyright of shooting the wrong thing or something. Occasionally I have copyright queries on my live stream. For example, when I streamed the audio of Sir Ernest Shackleton, a bot claimed that it was copyright to another organisation. I pointed out that I got it from a 1909 vintage original recording that I remastered myself in Brisbane, that Sir Ernest Shackleton died in 1922, 99 years ago, and that neither from a literary or a mechanical point of view can the recording concerned be under copyright. It has lapsed into the public domain. In fact, it lapsed into the public domain in the 1990s. So the challenge was put up and the video clip stood, and I seem to have won that battle. Round to Peter for a final VK3ACZ, VK3AML, and thank you for coming up too, Peter.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group VK3ACZ. And thank you too for going to all the effort that you do, and so glad that you won out with this Shackleton thing, because all that's pretty priceless. Anyway, I'll keep it brief because you want to go and visit a man with a horse. I didn't quite answer your question about the tuning. Through good luck rather than good management, I fluked on the right length for both of my NFED wires. I don't actually need a tuner right across all the bands. Well, the main bands are 80, 40, 20, 10, 15 and 10. They're within 2 to 1 wherever I am. They're often at 1 to 1 depending on what part of the band I'm on. But I have an auto tuner to touch them up anyway where needed. 6 definitely needs a tuner, but works on the shorter of the two wires. Again, what the propagation, what the radiation is like, I couldn't begin to imagine. And I've experimented with different shapes, and just the inverted V seems to work best. Anyway, now there was one last thing. Oh yes, I do have all the Crawford Homicide Division 4 and Matlocks. Absolutely love them. Trip down memory lane, especially the first 3 or 4 seasons of Homicide. Just love them. You don't see any of that stuff anymore. But anyway, all the more reason to appreciate the nostalgia involved in your recordings that you've got that you share with us. Anyway, good night, Chris. Good night, everybody. 7-3, and look forward to doing it again next week. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ. Good night, all.
Yeah, good night, Peter. And just for the people who've come through on the screen, VK3CD Rick, thank you for being there. Paul 3HN also. Whoever Pirate was, I think I might know who that is. Who else have we got there? Dan DTM and John Young. Thank you for your comments on the comments box, and Osmosis VK3CJN. I should think of the name there. You're down Narrawarren Ray, just breezing through as you're shutting down. I see we're down to about 5 people on the stream, so it's probably an appropriate plot time to close. We're just on 3 hours worth up since 9:50 p.m. when we restarted the stream. Hopefully next week it'll be more on time at 9:30. I'll cut back the stream speed a little to take account of that. So with that, this is VK3AML and Dave Ranson making a comment on the Jack the Ripper being possibly Alfred Deeming at the old Melbourne jail. Who knows? So this is VK3AML closing on 147.475, wishing everybody a very good night, and we'll be back at 9:30 p.m. here on this frequency next Saturday night, hopefully. Good night all. And VK3FTJS, hi Terry. I'm still on the stream, I'm just not on the air anymore. So I'll just close a few faders down and say thank you for being there, all the people on the YouTube stream, and we'll catch you also next Saturday night. Good night all.